military incursion. You think about Putin, you think about Ukraine, the instability that could come to Europe, both economically and even militarily, that's a challenge. It's unclear the Trump administration is prepared for, and we just don't know what moves the Trump administration will make to steady the ship. And of course, the global economy will depend on steadying that ship. So those are the kinds of unforeseen external shocks that could come earlier in the Trump administration than anyone's expecting.
Trump definitely takes a more bilateral view of the world, while the Democrats or the Biden administration had taken more of a multilateral view of the world. If Trump views the world bilaterally, who do you think is going to be his best partner in Europe?
That is a really interesting question. I just haven't seen any inclination from the prior Trump administration or his rhetoric now that he's looking for a partner. I mean, he sort of wants Putin to stay in his corner, maybe resolve Ukraine and look good for that. But, Trump is Trump. And as we see in domestic politics and international politics, he is a loner. He wants to exert influence where he can and where he can be successful. But he's not really interested in giving anything to other partners. And that's something that's really strikingly different from the U.S. foreign policy posture than we've seen from a lot of former presidents.
So we're less than a month away from his inauguration, Wendy. When it comes to the sequencing of things like tax cuts, immigration policy, as well as tariffs, how do you expect all of this to play out in Washington?
Well, Anne-Marie, as you well know, because you've discussed it and reported on it before, there's a difference between Mike Johnson and John Thune on getting reconciliation going and getting an early version of the tax cut, on the table and under consideration in both the House and the Senate. An early victory to extend the tax cuts, the Trump tax cuts, that would give the president a lot of momentum to focus on other things like border security. So border security he can do to some extent. If he invokes the military in trying to do border security, that will create controversy, and that could upend other kinds of domestic priorities he has, like the tax cut bill. One thing the Trump administration doesn't seem to quite get yet, which is surprising given they were there for 4 years before, is that these things are interrelated. If you ask somebody to make a politically difficult decision on, one issue, it's going to affect whether they're going to help you on another. And that's something these Republican leaders will have to manage, but it's unclear how well Trump will manage it.
Wendy Schiller, best of holidays to you. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Peter, what do you make of that? Is that what the market is picking up on, the fact that this isn't going to be so neat and tidy?
Yes, right. I think, as she pointed out, and you pointed out, everything tends to be bilateral and it's one-off, and yet there's a history, right? And countries don't forget what you said 6 months ago or a year ago, so I think a lot of that's going to go through. I think the one thing I would say from an Academy security standpoint, we're looking at Poland as being one of the big beneficiaries. We think what they've done in terms of the aid for Ukraine, how much is funneled through, how they've stood up, they will be a key component of whatever develops with NATO, and I think Poland's going to be a very good growth opportunity for next year.
We started that conversation talking about Panama Canal, but when it comes to Panama, when it comes to Greenland, what is Academy Securities, what are your generals telling you about what all these places mean in terms of China's influence?
So one, I think, go back to Greenland. I think back in the original Trump administration, he got in trouble for saying he should just buy Greenland, and then I think the Wall Street Journal did a great story about how China was effectively trying to buy Greenland. I think the Panama Canal fits into a broader story where we're increasingly worried about shipping, and we're advising clients that they really want to think about their shipping. They want to have multiple shipping routes. We're highly susceptible. We've seen in the Hormuz Strait in the Middle East, right, from attacks. You've seen the Panama Canal had just trouble because of water levels, but also increasingly we're starting to pay close attention, right? China has invested so much through the Belt and Road Initiative in all these various ports. They have so much equipment in these various ports. I think people have to rethink shipping and take a much more serious look and not be comfortable that it's going to be there the way it is today in 5 years.
Up next, we're going to look at another hot spot right now around the world, what's going on in Ukraine. My interview with President Volodymyr Zelensky from over the summer. You're watching Bloomberg Surveillance.
Do you think it'll be the case where someday you will be an investment committee or I'll be an investment committee and we just apply AI to decide whether it's a good deal or not, or we're not going to be there anytime soon?
I don't think we'll be there in the near term. And David, because being on investment committees, there's the analytics of the math, there's the people, and then there's judgment. So analytics and math, I think AI will help us get way more refined. Right now, we have analysts building models upon models. Our typical investment memo is 86 pages. So we could refine that down very, very seamlessly to pieces. The people aspect to it, to make a judgment call on, do I believe this entrepreneur is going to go the next mile? Do I believe that the background of the entrepreneur, who they are, what they stand for, their values, their family, that's the harder one. I think AI is going to take some time to get there. And then the final piece ends up being judgment. And I don't believe we've seen anything yet that gives us a sense of judgment that we're able to apply.
Start your trading day on Bloomberg Open Interest.
2 hours of single stock stories that are driving the opening bell action.
We'll take you to Wall Street, Main Street, the C-suite, and beyond.
These are companies that are growing their market.
The great companies in the U.S. are the companies hitting the cutting edge. That's a different story.
Get the inside track on what's buzzing in markets.
With the players who are shaping the narrative.
If you have bad earnings reports, you're going to get punished.
They're not buying what the industry is selling. Join us on Bloomberg Open Interest. Weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern, only on Bloomberg.
Good morning. Welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance on this day after Christmas. Thank you so much for joining us if you're tuning in, and happy holidays. This morning, we do have equity markets pulling back. We are a touch softer when it comes to S&P 500 futures and NASDAQ futures, down nearly 0.4%, and the Russell 200 futures down almost 0.5%. Although we should say it has been a bright spot for stocks this year. The S&P 500 closed up more than 1% on Tuesday, going into Christmas, extending this year's advance to 27%. Most of Europe is closed today for Boxing Days, and Asian equities were on their fourth day of gains. Switching up the boards, let's take a look at what's going on across asset. Here you have the bond board. You have yields rising this morning. Now the 10-year yield up 3 basis points, 4.61%. We should note we do have jobless claims out today at 8:30. Our survey has 223,000 claims penciled in. We also have an auction today. Lisa's not here, so I'll have to update you on what's going on in the auctions. U.S. is auctioning off $44 billion as 7-year notes. And then what we're looking at across the currency market, euro dollar today around 104. There it is, 104. I keep talking about how we entered 2024 with euro dollar around 110. The Europe has just been under pressure. It's ending the year with 2 political crises in its 2 main economies. And then, of course, the U.S. dollar has just been on an absolute tear. Under surveillance this morning, some stories we're watching. Netflix Christmas Day NFL debut went off without a hitch. The streaming giant hosted 2 primetime games yesterday, as well as a halftime show featuring Beyonce. The Grammy winner rode in on a white horse and played music from her country album, Cowboy Carter, for the first time in front of a live audience. The event was the 2nd most popular live title on Netflix to date, according to NFL Media. So, Peter, I don't know if you watched any of this, but Netflix has had a stunning year. It is up some 90% on this stock. Absolutely breathtaking in terms of how much it's growing. But now it's getting into live events. The first one had a few glitches, but this one seemed to do pretty well.
It seemed to go very well, though I guess having 2 points scored in a game by one team might be the first time it's ever finished that, so I think it could have been a more exciting game. But yeah, it seemed to do very well. I think everyone was watching. Does it glitch? Does it not glitch? It seemed to go very smoothly. We watched a bunch of it. I think it's, shows some potential. It is getting harder and harder, though, to figure out how to watch an NFL game. It's like you need like a, AI to help you find which channel these things are on.
True, and I believe Netflix also has one next year as well, right? And the following year?
Yeah, so I think, the NFL has been expanding. It plays now Thursdays, Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays. It's all over the networks. I think it's interesting. It does feel to me like it's getting harder for, a normal fan. It used to be easy, right? Saturday, Sunday, especially Sundays. Every game was on during playoff times. You kind of get the Saturday and Sunday. I don't know. I don't love it, to be honest.
It'll be interesting to see from Netflix how many people maybe signed up the day of Christmas because they wanted to make sure they can watch that game, or potentially they heard on Twitter that Beyonce was performing. If you weren't interested in the NFL, maybe you're interested in watching
I think the
her.
concert attracted as much attention as the games themselves.
Yeah, exactly. All right, also under surveillance this morning, President-elect Donald Trump doubling down his desire desire to purchase Greenland. In a post on Truth Social, Trump writing, quote, "Merry Christmas to the people of Greenland, which is needed by the United States for national security purposes and who want the U.S. to be there, and we will." Greenland's prime minister said the island is, quote, "not for sale and will never be for sale." You brought up a great point earlier, Peter. This is not just something the United States is trying to do. China has been trying to do this.
Yeah, I think you look, their airport's been underdeveloped. A lot of the natural resources there are underdeveloped, right? It could be a great source of geothermal energy, a lot of sustainable energy, and it's kind of been ignored, right? We all fly over to Europe and you fly right over Greenland. No one talks about it. No one does much about it. I think it's interesting. I think it should be developed. I think people have to figure out how to do. Denmark's always been supportive, but I think very little in way of support. China was trying to do much more. They were very involved both in the airport as well as some of the marine area and the energy. So I think we're going to get back in there. I think it's a huge opportunity.
This feels like vintage Trump from the first iteration. He tried to do this once before.
And I wish he would say things like invest in or cooperate with rather than buy or take over, that sort of thing. Again, I think same thing with Canada and, calling, Trudeau the governor. There's, I think, better ways to do this. I think the principles are right, and a lot of this makes perfect sense, and I think we should be doing this, should be much more developed. It can really help in terms of the progress we're trying to make in terms of sustainable resources. But I think we have to phrase it better, possibly, to get it done.
Okay. Russia's missile attack, we're also watching this, against Ukraine's power infrastructure on Christmas Day sparked condemnation from world leaders. Russia's today is rebuffing President-elect Trump's call for an immediate ceasefire, but saying it's ready to hold negotiations on a long-lasting peace deal. Over the summer, I traveled to Ukraine's capital and met with President Zelensky for an exclusive sit-down where he detailed the state of the ceasefire talks that have remained elusive so far.
Домовлялись сторони про ceasefire. We've had agreements about ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia, and Russia has been always breaking all the agreements and has been killing our people. So only if it's on some international forum in the presence of the countries, leaders who are trusted. They might have different ideas, different views on the stages, how this war will be over, but we all have to be on the same side. We have to trust each other. Trust is very important. The Peace Summit, by the way, has shown that we can follow this plan. Over 100 countries were there, and today we're talking about the nuclear security and energy security, and there will be a clear plan. So the ceasefire also needs a clear plan. We must understand that Russia would not be using ceasefire to simply accumulate equipment on the territory, our territory that they've occupied, because we will not be striking them. I mean, they can use that to create a strong fist here and then accuse us of breaking the ceasefire and start another invasion. So it's really complicated for us. It would take a significant loss for us if they invade again, as in the beginning of 2022, when they have almost reached the capital city, and they accumulated a lot of equipment on the territory of Belarus. And Belarus kept saying that, no, it's just the exercise. No occupation is in mind. It's just the training. It's just military games. It's very important. I really don't want to have this big trouble for my country, because we are at war already. Giving the advantage to Russia now, it's just impossible. We need to be smart. And it's important also who will be responsible for this, besides the Ukrainians who are paying with their lives. Which country will be responsible? It's easy to just talk about ceasefire, but it's very difficult to enforce it, to keep it. It's very difficult to find those who will respond why the ceasefire.
But we're going to see more calls for a ceasefire, especially as the world politically is moving to the right and potentially moving to the right in the United States. You have said this war is dependent on U.S. aid. I want to ask you, did you watch the presidential debate between Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump?
Передусім, So, first and foremost, the ceasefire is an important element in any plan to finish the war. So, a ceasefire is not finishing the war. We've been there. It would be just a frozen conflict. And it would be frozen for the aggressor, because it would be frozen on our territory, and our people would be under the occupation. This gives a clear advantage to one side. That's why it's easy to offer different proposals of ceasefires. But what's important? It's important to find answer what would come after. It's the matter of not just the victory. There are many people talking about ceasefire, and it's fine that people are talking, but what would happen next? That is the question. For example, what's the next step? What's the third step? What would be the step when Putin breaks the ceasefire? After the ceasefire, a month after the ceasefire, will he pull out the troops out of Ukraine? Who guarantees that he will pull the troops out of the occupied territories? And there's silence. Nobody has answer. I'm not accusing. I just want to explain that we are at war and we understand this. So, the debates.
Well, because the answer of how this might all unravel will depend on also who's at the table from the United States.
Amongst other things, it might depend on who is the president of the U.S. Yes, that's a fact. Because the U.S., the United States of America, today are probably the most powerful player. So the matter whether the United States would be the major international player, whether they want that or they want to focus more on their internal politics. I cannot say. It doesn't depend on me.
So did you watch the debate?
Yes, I watched the debates. So first and foremost, I want to say, I don't know, maybe it would be out of tune to what we see in the US media, but I watched, and we are not electing the president of the US, so I didn't look at the incumbent president and the former president. I looked at them in terms of Ukraine.
President Trump said he'll end the war before he's elected.
Yeah, I heard.
What do you make of that?
Let me be frank. For example, well, the decision is on US public. But let me just have some reasoning. Але для вас це важливо. Yes. So let us imagine that the winner might be Trump in November. And he knows how to end the war. He has a plan. Me, as the president of a country at war, not a theoretical person, but a real-life person, I would like to be prepared. We are 40 million. We're a big country, and we really depend on the aid from the world. And we depend on the aid and the position and the stance of the US. So I would like to understand, what would it mean to finish war fast? Tomorrow, do we want the war to be over tomorrow? The war didn't to start. It was Putin who started it. But I hope you agree that it would be fair. If Trump knows how to end this war, he should tell us today. Because if there are risks to Ukraine's independence, if there are risks that we will lose the statehood, we want to be prepared for this. We want to understand whether in November we will have the powerful support of the US or we'll be all alone.
That was part of my interview with Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky over the summer. Peter, what do you make of the fact that this is a hot conflict that's going to be passed on from the Biden administration's Trump administration? Trump says he will end the war before he gets into office. That's obviously not going to happen. But what are you and the generals thinking about at Academy?
So I think two things. One is I think Trump does not necessarily back either side. So I don't think he's committed to, either side necessarily winning. I think he wants to, find some sort of a deal. And I think he views himself as the teacher coming into the schoolyard and picking the two kids and telling them, you're going to sit down and figure something out. I think he's going to use a carrot and stick argument with both of them. So there's going to be threats. There's going to be cajoling. I do think the fact that we had these Russian frozen dollar reserves, that will be a big part of Trump's negotiation, how he divvies those back up. Unfortunately, I do think that until this truce occurs or a peace occurs, you're actually going to see an escalation in the conflict because both sides are trying to redefine the borders. Assuming Trump comes in, assuming Trump's going to push them, they want to be in the best negotiating stance possible. And I think that's the sad part of this, is that's why you're seeing the violence increase.
So it's an escalate to de-escalate potentially.
Yeah, I think from both sides. So they want to kind of lock in as much as they can coming into this. And then I think probably both sides realize Ukraine, it's almost, when we go through this from a military standpoint, it's very difficult for Ukraine to win and push the Russians out permanently. It's just a matter of numbers. On the other hand, I think it's quite clear that it's very difficult for Russia to really take over and accomplish everything they wanted. So at some point, both of them must be looking for some way to claim victory and move on.
Potentially Trump offers the off-ramp. All right, that is one story we'll be watching deeply in 2025. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning. Here's your Bloomberg Brief, Yahira Hackis. Hey, Yahira.
Hi, Anne-Marie. China's finance and property companies saw their workforces shrink for the first time in recent years. The financial sector lost 32% of its staff, while developers saw a 27% drop, according to data released today. Financial firms have been hit by a widening government crackdown, while the housing market has suffered the worst downturn in China's modern history, pushing developers into default. Meanwhile, Russia has rejected President-elect Trump's call for an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine while showing willingness to hold talks on a long-lasting peace agreement. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov saying in a news conference today that a ceasefire is, quote, a road to nowhere. Trump on Sunday had suggested that he's open to meeting his Russian counterpart to discuss ending the war. And Uber's plan to buy Foodpanda's Taiwan business was rejected by the country's antitrust regulator. Uber said it was disappointed by the decision, but plans to continue to invest in Taiwan as one of the world's fastest growing food delivery markets. The deal would have given Uber and Foodpanda a combined market share of over 90%. Uber has not mentioned any plans to appeal the decision. Meanwhile, Japan Airlines was forced to halt ticket sales earlier today and delay flights due to a cyber attack during peak winter travel season. Ticket sales are now back up and running after being halted as a result of the incident. The company said systems have been restored without any leakage of customer data and no damage. This comes after American Airlines suffered a technical glitch Christmas Eve. That's your Bloomberg Brief. Anne-Marie?
Thanks so much, Yahira. Up next, a new chapter for the U.S. and China.
If China or any other country makes us pay a 100 or 200% tariff or tax, we will make them pay a reciprocal tariff or tax of 100 or 200%.
China thinks we're a stupid country, a very stupid country. They can't believe that somebody finally got wise to them.
That's coming up next. You're watching Bloomberg Surveillance.
Names in business are on Bloomberg.
We are in the midst of the largest wealth transfer in history right at this very moment. So $100 trillion of wealth is going to next-gen and millennial clients over the next decade. So that has some pretty significant implications. But in addition to that, women are controlling more and more global wealth. Today, they control a third of global wealth, but in the next 5 years, 30 trillion is going to pass in the hands of women, and they're going to control over 50% of the global wealth market out there today. Women care deeply about investing with purpose, investing to make an impact, doing good with their investments. So you're going to see some significant opportunities for us as we lean in and have been leaning in to capturing more of the female wallet globally.
Nobody covers business like Bloomberg. Context changes everything. The top names at the Fed are on Bloomberg.
The median projection is 2 rate cuts next year. That makes sense to me, but we have to remain agile. Every meeting is live from the standpoint that you're debating, you're discussing, you're thinking what's the right level of policy. But my projection is that it will take many fewer rate cuts next year than we thought, but I'll watch the economy and see if that works out.
Nobody covers the Fed like Bloomberg.
Key investors, top executives, global innovators. Join me for in-depth conversations with the biggest newsmakers on the day's top stories. Insight with Haslinda Anand, only on Bloomberg.
Good morning. Welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance. This day after Christmas, thank you so much for joining us. When it comes to the Santa Claus rally, we are seeing a little bit of a pullback. Red across the screen when it comes to S&P 500 futures, also NASDAQ futures. You could see S&P 500 futures there, down nearly 0.4%. We are seeing yields climb higher today. On the 10-year basis, 10-year yield is up 3 basis points now, 4.62%. Seeing a little bit march higher on these yields as we go into year end. Under surveillance this morning, a new chapter for the U.S. and China.
If China or any other country makes us pay a 100 or 200% tariff or tax, we will make them pay a reciprocal tariff or tax of 100 or 200%. We made a fortune on it. Tariffs, properly used, which we will do, and being reciprocal with other nations, but it'll make our country rich.
China thinks we're a stupid country, a very stupid country. They can't believe that somebody finally got wise to them.
Here's the latest. Investors bracing for a U.S.-China trade war with President-elect Trump pledging massive blanket tariffs on imports from the country beginning as early as Inauguration Day. Shahzad Qazi of China's Beige Book saying the effects may not be so immediate, writing Trump can be convinced by his cabinet principles and must to reconsider an aggressive tariff agenda. And more importantly, the tariff war isn't something investors will truly have to deal with till more or less early 2026. Shahzad joins us now. Shahzad, thank you so much for spending the morning with us. Tell us why potentially we have an entire year left before we start thinking about tariffs.
Yeah, I think this is the market consensus. It's important to point out that they don't, investors have decided that they don't have to worry about tariffs and they don't have to worry about a trade war till more or less 2026. I should caution that I think that's probably not going to be the case. You have the team that's being assembled as we speak, the economic team that's being assembled by the transition that is still very much going to be making sure that the president has what he needs in order to make big, bold pronouncements, threats, and maybe even announce some decisions as soon as he gets into office. So I think markets are going to get rattled by the tariff threat and perhaps the announcement of tariffs, at least by the president himself, far earlier than they currently anticipate.
What kind of fiscal firepower do you think China has to retaliate against what Trump plans on doing?
Well, look, they're trying to conserve as much dry powder as they possibly can. The reality is that if they want to double down and support their industrial sector, which is by the way, what they're gearing towards doing. The latest announcements that they've made about bond sales, at least a third of that is going directly towards supporting the manufacturing sector. They have quite a bit of capacity to continue doing so and making sure that Chinese factories are able to, produce and supply products on the global markets at very competitive prices, even after you account for tariffs. Keep in mind, Chinese products are already incredibly low price right now.
So one of the questions I have for you is, they seem to be addressing the production side. What are they doing to address the demand side? Is that something China's done enough for? Is that something they're going to have to do ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, the second developing consensus right now, that there's going to be sort of this big direct household-focused stimulus that we're going to get in 2025. I remain quite skeptical of that. They are not, as yet, really focusing on sustainably stimulating consumer demand. They've announced more subsidy programs, trade-ins and such. You can pull growth forward. You can get a little bit of a boost. But I think even as we're seeing right now, it's very limited. It's not sustained. But the reality is that we haven't heard, at least as yet, anything out of the Communist Party or any of Chinese officials about large-scale direct household-focused stimulus, which could actually generate or spur domestic consumer demand. So it seems very much like supply side is where their mind's at.
At some point, if the economy continues to remain weak and struggle, does this represent a threat to either Xi or the Communist Party? Is this something they have to really address, or can they let this slide for a period of time?
Well, I think Secretary Xi and the top officials there understand very clearly that China's economy is slowing regardless of what happens. It is absolutely going to continue growing below 5%. Even there, years where they claim it's going to be at 5%, we should be very skeptical of that. So it's not the growth slowdown that scares them as much as, they want to make sure that they make China a global manufacturing, or rather industrial superpower. They want to absolutely dominate high-tech manufacturing, and they need to figure out a way to employ their people. It's that picture that they're more concerned about rather than just the top-rate growth. I think a lot of that really is, quite frankly, still the obsession of Wall Street more than Xi or anybody else in China.
You have such great insight into China with your data collection. Can you give us a sense on how strong or weak the Chinese consumer is right now?
Yeah, I think, what we've seen happen this year is that the Chinese consumer has actually been performing better than expected, and even at times that's been assumed. So, we've seen a split between spending oftentimes on experiences or oftentimes on goods. Now, what we're not getting, of course, is consumers just going out there and spending on everything, of course. So, in the larger scheme of things, consumer spending has been, of course, weak, but, it's not catastrophically so, and it's certainly not in a major crisis situation. And I think more credit could have been given this year to Chinese consumers than they got.
Shahzad, thank you so much for your time today. Shahzad Kazi of China Beige Book. Coming up next on the program, Sarah Hunt of Alpine Saxon Woods, former State Department spokesperson Morgan Ortagus, and Jason Bazinet of Citi. Peter Cheer, thank you so much for joining me for this hour. What's your one top piece of advice for 2025?
I think be careful of Trump because he does like chaos, and anytime you get complacent, look for the rug pull.
There we go. Look for the rug pull. This morning, S&P 500 futures down more than 0.3%. Another hour of surveillance coming up next. This is Bloomberg.
Asia is at the forefront of some of the world's biggest stories. I'm Sherrian in Tokyo.
And I'm Heidi Stroud-Watts here in Sydney, where the trading day begins. We're here in the center of all the action to get you set up with the numbers, news, and knowledge you need for the day ahead.
The demand is indeed recovering. We've been waiting for this moment.
The opportunity of a century.
Join us on Bloomberg The Asia Trade. Weekdays only on Bloomberg TV. Context changes everything.
just have to strategize with each other, with our team, with our agents, with everyone to figure out how can we package something that's going to be able to go straight down the middle and hit it out of the park. Because right now, people are going to be more adverse. We'll look at our slate, and while something was amazing 3 years ago and felt like we were going to be able to get it made, we have to figure out how to build off of that today. How can we make it feel more desirable? How can we make it feel more undeniable?
It's important to clarify that straight down the middle doesn't mean bland. No. It doesn't mean for the most common denominator. It doesn't mean trying to make something for everybody, something that doesn't have edges or specificity. Straight down the middle almost means the opposite in this moment, right? It means so strategic, so specific, so clear. So I think one of the kind of unexpected, wonderful impacts of how challenging the ecosystem has become is that we have had to make sure that we are more committed to content than we've ever been before. Because the fight is so real that if we jump onto something or we develop something, we have no choice but to have to love it.
Morning, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda.
Taking you from the U.S. market's close to the overnight session in Asia. We'll walk you through what you need to know to kickstart the European trading day. Live from our European headquarters, we bring you the day's top market-moving stories, unmatched expert analysis, and on-the-ground reporting from across the continent. Tune in to Daybreak Europe, only on Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything.
There is this real momentum from Wall Street. We are basically deep in the European earnings season.
Take a look at how we're faring when it comes to Asian markets.
The top names in global leadership are on Bloomberg.
When it comes to tariffs, we need to be very clear. The European Union is negotiating as a whole, so there's no room to have bilateral agreements. It's a core competency of the Commission. But speaking about the art of the deal, I think a deal can be made when it comes to the U.S.-European trade relations.
Nobody covers the top global leaders like Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
As far as the stock market, I'd say it's reasonably priced for another decent year.
There's just been a lot more kind of idiosyncratic risk out there. Volatility is kind of a little bit all over the place.
What tends to happen, though, in January is all the sort of market moves that we have in December get completely unwound.
We're going through a nominal regime shift to a higher nominal GDP condition.
We trust the data, but we take it with a grain of salt. We look at a broad measure of every type of indicator.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Farrell, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
From New York City for audience worldwide, good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. John and Lisa are off today. I'm Anne-Marie Hordern, holding down the fort for you this hour with Sarah Hunt of Alpine Saxon Woods. Thank you, Sarah, so much for joining me this morning. Merry Christmas and happy holidays to you and your family. We have this Santa rally having a little bit of a halt. Not actually going on the day after Christmas this morning. S&P 500 futures down more than 0.3% this morning. How difficult is this moment to price equity markets between this weird week between Christmas and New Year's?
I think it's difficult, but I also think that you have some ancillary information that we got both from the Fed meeting and then from the CR fight, which is how fast are we going to get some of the things that we thought we were going to get into 2025? And I think that took a little bit of the wind out of the sails, both the Fed being more hawkish and then the concern about whether or not things can actually get done. So I think that just makes what was going to be a challenging year to parse anyway even more challenging.
Yes, definitely is going to be a challenging year. If you think about how people were thinking about 2024 and how the year ended up shaping out, especially when you think of things like Fed rate cuts, didn't exactly pan out to how investors were looking.
No, people were expecting far more rate cuts. The beginning of the year had the data that made people realize that those rate cuts might not come as fast. We finally got some in September. And I think that the expectations have not been correct. So when people get worried about changing those expectations, in the end, they've been wrong for the last 2 years. So I think we're going to have to see, really, we got some good PCE data after the Fed meeting that was at least slightly on the weaker side. side, and I think that that helps. So it's really going to be a scrutiny of each data point as they come out, and people are going to be looking to how that works in with what the Fed's sort of mindset is.
Well, we do get one data point today, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time. We will have jobless claims. This is what our survey is looking for. 223,000 claims are penciled in. Of course, claims data does fluctuate around the holidays. As we've been saying, the Santa rally, that really isn't so much, not so merry this morning. S&P 500 futures clawing back some of those gains we made on Tuesday, down 0.3%, but still, the S&P 500 closed up higher on Tuesday, which extended this year's rally to 27%. Euro dollar this morning, bang on 104. We started the year around 110. The dollar's just been on a tear, and things have been very difficult when it comes to the Eurozone. 10-year yield, we do have yields climbing this morning, up 3.4 basis points. You have a 10-year yield of 4.62%. And then crude, a little bit firmer as well this morning at $70 for New York crude. Coming up this hour, former State Department spokesperson Morgan Ortagus with tensions in the Middle East continuing through the holidays. Jason Bazinet of Citi on Netflix's first foray into football, and highlights from David Gurr's interview with U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. We begin this hour, though, with stocks on track for their third straight year of gains, even though we do have futures clawing back a little bit. Sarah Hunt says we expect some potential volatility at the start of the year, but also see a reasonably good trajectory for the economy and therefore earnings, at least in the United States. Can some of the measures discussed, such as tariffs and deportations, have an inflationary effect? It is certainly possible, but the timing of that is not clear. If the underlying strength in spending can be maintained and earnings can grow as projected, it may not be a lump of coal being delivered in 2025. Sarah is still with us for the entire hour. Sarah, thank you so much. So how difficult at this moment is it to think about 2025?
Well, you have a lot of uncertainty. Besides the fact that we've got a new administration and a new Congress, there are, again, questions about what parts of the agenda are going to be implemented when, what are the abilities for some of the good things that markets are expecting and investors are expecting to happen, the timing on those. I think that it's just going to be a challenge as we get through the beginning of it to see where things are going to shake out and when. And I think that, the good news on equity markets is that you have the quantum computing story to add to the AI story. So that's added a layer of story, and equity markets like stories, especially in the U.S. So I think that is good news, but you're going to have to continue to see earnings come through. We're not trading at a low level on markets or a low PE multiple. So if you don't see the earnings and the earnings growth coming through, I think that's going to cause markets to struggle a little bit too. But we expect to see some earnings growth come through.
Are markets potentially pulling back now because all these questions they have going into 2025, all the good stuff you mentioned about Trump is already baked in?
I think it's a combination of that and a combination of the fact that things got very lofty. I mean, you look at some of the charts and you see that there were some really strong moves. And even if multiples come down a little bit for a lot of stocks, they're still going to be expensive. So I think it was a combination of, well, maybe we're not going to get what we want as quickly as we want it, but also we did have quite a big move towards the end of the year in November. So I think that December's a little bit got pulled forward into November. And so that some of that movement higher in the market that happened in November is leaving December a little slower.
Everyone was talking about the end of 2025 broadening out, especially around the Trump trade. Do you actually think 2025 we could see a broadening out in equity markets?
You have to see the economy do well. And for the economy to do well, you have to, interest rates are a part of that. The expectation on interest rates is a part of that. But the truth of the matter is you just need to see decent economic statistics for that to broaden out. Because broadening out really means that the mid and the small cap stocks are going to start to do better. And it's not just the giant tech companies that are continuing to do well. And you really need a good economic backdrop for that. It's pretty benign at the moment. If it stays that way, I think that you will see some of that growth, but you have to see that coming from those smaller stocks for that to work.
How much of an uphill climb is that, though, when you have yields rising? Even the yields this morning are on the march.
It is a challenge. It sort of depends. I mean, this comes back to where our balance sheets, right? So if I think about what broadening out means, it also means for us, the smaller and mid-cap stocks with good balance sheets and good cash flow. If you don't have that, then yes, rates are more of an issue. But we've had rates at these levels or higher levels for a couple of years, and it hasn't really shaken out as much as people might have expected it to. So it really depends on where you sit in how your balance sheet looks. And I think that if you've got a decent balance sheet, and then you should be able to see some growth, and those higher yields are less of an issue for you.
You mentioned things like quantum computing and AI. Is basically one piece of advice to investors: ignore everything that goes on in Washington, D.C., and just focus on these two stories. Can you make money just doing that?
Well, so far you've been able to make money just doing that, but there's been a lot of volatility in there too, and I think that that's part of the volatility will continue in that group as people as it waxes and wanes. But the upside on the AI trade has been that other companies, besides technology companies, have started talking about how they're benefiting. That's an important piece to that story. Had that not been the case, I think you would have seen more volatility this year. But that gives you an earnings push for other companies outside the technology space, and that also means the adoption is going to continue and the spending is going to continue, because that's really what drives a lot of this. So you can ignore some of the things, but from a sector perspective, there will be other parts of what happens in Washington is going to make a difference. But right now, the technology sector is sort of in its own world, and that is driving a positive effect for the equity market.
A sector you've liked this year that definitely is going to take cues from Washington, D.C. is energy. Are you still liking the energy space?
I think that the energy space, what people are starting to realize, it hasn't necessarily gone through in a lot of the stocks, although you've seen the pipeline certainly have a move higher, is that the legacy hydrocarbon usage is not going to go away as fast as people expected. And therefore, you're going to see a lot more investment in that industry where people thought it was a dying industry. And I don't think that that's the case. The question really is, how well can companies benefit from that? And like I said, the pipelines are seeing it because those are assets that are very difficult to replicate. But you're still going to see, as natural gas prices rise in Europe, the LNG trade and other parts of that do well in the U.S. And I think that that's something that is going to become, again, more interesting. You've also got decent yields in that, and the multiples are not as challenging as on those sectors.
And do you think an ushering in of the Trump administration means more deregulation, means there's room for these companies to grow and expand?
I think it's less likely that they're going to face problems that they would have faced potentially otherwise, and some of the issues. Whether or not that can really be pulled out to a longer and better trajectory remains to be seen. But certainly I think that some of the challenges are going to be less problematic, because I think this is an administration that feels more strongly about the older energy situation than some others.
What other sectors do you like going into next year?
I think that some of the industrials look good, but there's some expensive stocks in that sector as well. I think that you are looking at some of the areas that are not participating, right? So staples have come down a lot. So that's an area that could be interesting because the cash flows are there, but the growth isn't enormous. I think that some of the consumer stuff may be under pressure this year. It depends on, again, let's see what happens with wages and employment. I think a lot of the questions on the economy are going to be, where do people spend? And right now, there's still a lot of spending in experiences. So that area is still doing pretty well. You look at some of the travel companies like Booking, and you look at some of those, and those stocks are continuing to do well. So there are areas that we think are going to continue. I think you have to be a little bit careful on consumer discretionary, and I think that there are some opportunities, like I said, in places that are underloved, like energy and materials, that are more looking at the world as if it's not going to grow as much as some of the other sectors.
When it comes to all of these companies, how do you think tariffs are going to impact them, especially consumer discretionary?
I think the question is it going to be a bludgeon? Is it going to be a soft tap? We don't know yet what's going to start from the beginning. We've heard a lot of things bandied about in terms of levels and everything else. I think it does matter how high those levels are. If they're punitive, you're going to see some problems in the spending there. But if it's something that's more of a stick and not a carrot, then I think that that's less of a problem. It really is going to depend on how fast they're implemented, what levels they're implemented at, and what the trade-offs may be to get them reduced if it comes in at a high level. If people think that it's going to be high and stay there, it could be problematic for spending.
Sarah Hunt, you're going to be sticking with us throughout the hour. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning. Here's your Bloomberg Brief with Yahira Hackes. Hey, Yahira.
Hi, Anne-Marie. China's parliament ousted 2 military lawmakers without explanation, citing suspected violations of law and discipline. The move is seen as part of an ongoing anti-corruption campaign in the military, which has been in full effect since last summer. President Xi Jinping has focused efforts on consolidating his power over the military, which has included a reorganization of the armed forces and the replacement of senior officials. Meanwhile, Uber's plan to buy Foodpanda's Taiwan business was rejected by the country's antitrust regulator. Uber said it was disappointed by the decision, but plans to continue to invest in Taiwan as one of the world's fastest growing food delivery markets. The deal would have given Uber and Foodpanda a combined market share of over 90%. Uber has not mentioned any plans to appeal the decision. And a dead body was found in the wheel well of a United Airlines aircraft, according to the New York Times. The death is under investigation, and the person has not been identified, according to the local police department. The flight departed Chicago on Tuesday morning and landed in Maui, Hawaii in the afternoon local time. That's Bloomberg Brief. Anne-Marie?
Thank you so much, Yahira. Up next, outlook for the Middle East.
I'm optimistic that there are more opportunities for regional players to improve the Middle East with Iran's, the collapse of Iran's axis of resistance. We need a strong team in the United States to provide assistance and guidance.
A lot of red lines were evaporated in the Middle East this year. That conversation coming up next with Morgan Ortagus. You're watching Bloomberg Surveillance.
Bloomberg covers the world with unmatched reach and resources. From more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, context changes everything. The countdown is on. Everything you need to get the edge at the end of the market day.
Big tech earnings kick off later this afternoon.
Gilead is coming out right now.
We have Take-Two numbers. Back to the markets, right? Our bread and butter.
NVIDIA is one of the best stories in the tech space. That actually matters a whole lot more. It might shock some of your viewers. You're watching The Close.
Get ahead of tomorrow's trading with The Close. Weekdays on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Morning from our world headquarters in New York. I'm Manus Credit.
And I'm Danny Berger. Let's set your agenda.
Bloomberg Brief delivers the market news, data, and analysis you need live every weekday only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Good morning and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance. Happy holidays and Merry Christmas if you are joining us this morning. The Santa rally is halted this morning. We should note S&P 500 futures are a little bit lower today. Alongside as well, we do have the 10-year Treasury yield climbing. It's up 4 basis points now, 4.63%. And euro-dollar now dipping below 104. We've seen the dollar on a tear, and absolutely euro just crumble throughout this year. It started off 2025 hovering around 110. Now it's at 103.95. And New York crude this morning, $70.42, just a touch firmer on crude this morning, up nearly 0.5%. Under surveillance this morning, the outlook for the Middle East.
I'm optimistic that there are more opportunities for regional players to improve the Middle East with Iran's, the collapse of Iran's axis of resistance. At the same time, this requires an international effort to support those players. We need a strong team in the United States to provide assistance and guidance without pulling ourselves into this mess.
Here's the latest. Uncertainty in the Middle East adding to global geopolitical risk between the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Iranian proxies, and Russia's growing influence in the region. Former U.S. State Department spokesperson Morgan Ortagus writing, quote, President Trump will deliver peace once again in the Middle East because he knows how to use both carrots and sticks to achieve outcomes. Morgan joins us now. Morgan, happy holidays to you and your family. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I want to pick up what's going on in and Israel. We had yesterday Benjamin Netanyahu's office coming out and saying that Hamas was basically backtracking on some of the promises they agreed to upon as they try to have this ceasefire hostage agreement. The two sides still are talking, though, and we did have representatives from Israel in Qatar. Do you think we will see an agreement before President Trump's inauguration on January 20th?
Well, we need to, and I think both President Biden and now President-elect Trump, both of their teams are working pretty aggressively on this to see this happen. You've seen President Trump make statements that the hostages better be returned or else. And by the way, that goes back to his convention speech last summer when he brought up the hostages. When you look at the Middle East writ large, first of all, there's almost always geopolitical risk there. Anytime I'm going around the world and doing geopolitical risk conversations, I never skip over the Middle East. So you always have to factor that in. But whether you're looking to a possible peace agreement between Saudi and Israel, or whether you're looking at how in the world the U.S. helps influence Syria, none of these pieces on the chess table move until you get the hostages home, until you get a ceasefire in Gaza. That's sort of the catalyst for anything else happening.
We have seen Steve Witkoff, who Trump has named as one of his envoys coming in, actually go into the region. Do you see a peaceful transfer in terms of relationships between the Biden administration and incoming Trump officials?
I do. I think Jake Sullivan and Brett McGurk, listen, I've known Brett since my Iraq days, I think back in 2007. But Brett worked actually in the first Trump administration. So I think when you look at Jake Sullivan, Brett McGurk, Mike Waltz, of course, the incoming National Security Advisor, and Steve Witkoff, it does appear that the four of them are working and coordinating quite closely together. Because listen, nothing is more important to either administration than getting these three remaining Americans who we believe still to be alive, getting them home. And of course, you want the bodies of Americans as well. So I think that's one of the areas that you can see bipartisan consensus, and you can see people working together. Of course, you know, I also think that Saudi and Israel is a high priority for both administrations to get some recognition and to get a peace deal there. And I think the reason that it's so important, as we've seen Iran's proxy empire sort of falling apart around the Middle East, there's going to be vacuums. We see Turkey trying to fill the vacuum in Syria, for example. So as Iran's proxy empire decreases and lessens, you really need Saudi Arabia and Israel to sort of stand up and fill in that vacuum as well.
That was going to be a question that I had, which is there's an opportunity here, but then there's also some concern that it could get worse instead of better, or worse before it gets better. And how do we know who the players are and who the real power is behind the curtain at the moment, because there's so much chaos in front of the curtain? Do you feel like there's a strong ability to understand who the better outcomes might be?
Yeah, it's always hard, right? You make such a great point, because we all cheered whenever Assad, escaped to Russia, whenever his regime fell, because of the civil war and the hundreds of thousands of his own people that he massacred. But as true with the Middle East, the minute Assad is gone, you start looking at HTS and others and thinking, oh, well, maybe we didn't actually want former al-Qaeda elements governing the country as well. I'll tell you one thing that I think that we have to keep our eye on the ball. The one piece of sort of Iran's proxy empire that still remains vigilant and active is the Houthis in Yemen. Of course, in the Trump administration, we designated them an FTO, a foreign terrorist organization. That designation was removed later. A lesser designation, an SDGT, was given by the Biden regime. When you look at the Houthis, they have been able to completely disrupt commercial and international trade in the region. We've seen them directly go after U.S. Navy ships. We've seen ballistic missiles, advanced drones. By the way, we've seen some of them go all the way from Yemen to Israel, where they tried to hit U.S. diplomatic facilities in Israel. And of course, they continue to try to attack Israel as well. We see that. And to me, that is one thing that I think is when you look at action in the region, what's most eminent is between Israel and the United States and the larger free world. You cannot continue to have a terrorist organization that shoots ballistic missiles drones and sophisticated weapons and completely disrupts international trade. I mean, it's untenable that it's gone on since October 7th. It has to be stopped. You're seeing more Israel and U.S. strikes. I think that that's going to have to be ramped up pretty significantly, and it's sort of a shame in the second term of the Obama administration that we told Saudi and UAE to take their foot off the gas as it relates to the Houthis, because now they've developed into one of the more sophisticated proxies that Iran possesses.
When it comes to Iran and the incoming Trump administration, do you think Trump is willing to do a deal with Iran, or is it going to go back to immediately maximum pressure campaign?
Great question. President Trump said unequivocally in his first term that Iran would not obtain a nuclear weapon on his watch. He will have to clarify if that's still his policy for his second term. I assume it will be, but it's in a much different place than it was 4 years ago. So 4 years ago, the regime was starved of cash. We now know because of lax enforcement of sanctions. You know, the max economic pressure sanctions, they're still on the books. They just haven't been enforced. So I think coming back into this new term, the Trump team can go back into, it's not even actually going back into max pressure again because those sanctions are still there. It's just enforcing the sanctions that are on the books. However, that is sort of like putting a genie back in the bottle. This was a massive diplomatic effort for us in the first term to get China and India, Japan. I mean, you can go around the world to get these countries to stop buying Iranian oil. So enforcing those sanctions means, you know, it's a lot of heavy diplomatic work. I do think that the Trump administration will likely, again, enforce the sanctions that are on the books. President Trump will have to look at a very difficult situation where Iran is, I mean, they're basically at breakout now. Oh, and by the way, the JCPOA is essentially expiring in 2025. So this is a deal that we have, the collective Republicans and Democrats in Washington, we've been arguing about for, you know, a decade now since President Obama worked on this. Most of the sunset provisions are there. There are things that Elise Stefanik could do at the UN if she is confirmed as UN ambassador related to snapback sanctions. So there's certainly mechanisms at the UN and the E3, the United States, Britain, Germany, France, that we could work on together as it relates to Iran sanctions. But 2025 is going to be a very difficult year for the Iran portfolio because of those major provisions sunsetting in the JCPOA. So what comes next? That's the million-dollar question, or maybe the billion-dollar question.
Well, and that also goes to the question, or goes to the problem of the Houthis, right? Because part of it is funding, and if that if you can stop the funding there, or at least cut that funding off, the question really is how many assets do they have, and what's that time frame in between? Because if we do start to get some stronger sanctions, is there then too much already money there, and that continues to let them be problematic? I mean, I do think that that's a big issue, not just for the U.S., but for everybody, because that trade route and that oil route is very important for the entire world. That might help get other people on board, but it's a little bit hard to tell at this point because there's so much going on.
Yeah, when you look at the effectiveness of sanctions, and this is an argument I know that you've had many times on your show, I started at Treasury, I think back in 2008, working on sanctions, and we know that sanctions are never meant to be, the whole piece of, the whole pie, I should say, just a piece of the pie. So when you look at the Houthis, if we start implementing sanctions on Iran, again, that are on the books, will that help us be able to, decimate or downgrade, I should say, part of Iran's ability to fund these terror organizations? Don't forget we have the Shia militias in Iraq as well. That will certainly help, but now the Houthis in many ways have a vast network. So you're going to have to look at. We don't really have a U.S. Diplomatic presence there. The U.S. military would like to focus on China. You look at incoming Undersecretary for Policy at the Defense Department, Bridge Colby. He's been yelling for 4 years on Twitter that we need to reprioritize and focus on Asia. But if you have a terrorist group shooting ballistic missiles at your new U.S. Navy ships in another theater, that means we're constantly using other resources to try and degrade the Houthis. That means you're sending more ships. That means you're using more of our TLAM supply, things that we would be using theoretically in a China fight. So it's not going to be easy to downgrade the Houthis. We're going to have to certainly work with regional partners, and that probably means getting the Gulf countries to deal with the Houthis once again, in addition to the Israelis. So that's really where we're going to see a lot of
We're going to have to leave it there, Morgan. Thank you so much for joining us. Morgan Ortagus. This is Surveillance.
From our studios in New York and San Francisco, our expert hosts have the data and analysis about the companies you know and the startups to watch, plus the interviews you don't want to miss. Watch Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow on Bloomberg Technology, the only daily business show dedicated to tech, right in the middle of the trading action, every weekday, only on Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything. The countdown is on. Everything you need to get the edge at the end of the market day. Get ahead of tomorrow's trading with The Close, weekdays on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Bringing you up to the minute economic news whenever and wherever it happens. I'm Jennifer Zabasanja in Luanda, Angola, and this is Bloomberg.
It's the countdown to the market open as we bring you the first trades across Europe.
We'll debate the most important stories and what will drive the big investment decisions throughout the morning. I'm Guy Johnson.
I'm Kriti Gupta.
And I'm Anna Edwards. Join us every weekday morning for the opening trade, live at 7 a.m. here in London.
Only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance. The day after Christmas, a viewer does write in instead of a Santa Claus rally. It's a Santa Pause rally. Ha ha ha. This is what we're seeing across the boards this morning. Futures are lower. You're seeing red on the screen across the board. S&P 500 futures down 0.3%. The volumes, you have to imagine, are light. Most people are at home, still enjoying the holidays with their families like John and Lisa, unlike me, that is dedicated to my job and here at the office. What we're seeing across assets this morning, yields are climbing this morning, actually. We do have the 10-year yield now up more than 3 basis points, 4.62%. You have a lot of big calls for next year when it comes to what's going on in the Treasury market. Everyone is saying yields potentially, we're going to have to live it higher for longer when it comes to the Fed, but also the fact that potentially we could see a 10-year yield, according to T. Rowe Price, as high as 5%, even maybe 6%. And at some point, does that start to push back on some of these potential hopeful Trump policies that the incoming administration want to enact? Also, note for your calendar today in your diary, jobless claims will be coming out at 8:30. Our survey has 223,000 claims penciled in. We should note data around the holidays, they tend to fluctuate. And what's going on in terms of the currency space, euro dollar, it is getting a lot cheaper to go to Europe these days if you're an American. Just below 104 this morning. Came into the year and this currency pair was around 110. It has been a rough road for the Eurozone. Under surveillance this morning, and maybe it's going to get rougher, President-elect Donald Trump naming Kevin Marino Cabrera to serve as U.S. ambassador to Panama. Cabrera serves as a district commissioner of Miami-Dade County and worked for the Trump campaign in 2020. The announcement following Trump's call for the U.S. to regain control of the Panama Canal. So, Sarah, he keeps coming out with these grievances. I think President Trump thinks it's Festivus. Grievances when it comes to Panama, Greenland, Canada, Mexico, and China. All these stories, though, have one common theme, which actually is China, and China's growing influence, especially in a place like Panama. What do you make of all this as you're trying to decipher what matters in terms of policy for 2025?
Well, I think, if you go back to his first term, there are some of these things that had been brought up originally then as well. And I think that what it says is a little bit more of an outward-looking U.S., like we're looking at these areas that could be influenced, and we're saying we don't want that influence there. Whether or not that's helpful or hurtful remains to be seen, because does that drive people away further from the U.S., or does it make them say, okay, the U.S. is now paying attention and we need to figure out how to coexist in a more friendly way? I think that we don't know the answers to those questions yet, and I think really that's going to depend on a variety of different things, but even talking about the strategic usefulness of some of those areas is different than what we've been living with for the last 4 years. So I think that those differences are going to have to eventually square themselves, but we don't know yet. Right now, it's a lot of discussion.
One area, one sector that is preparing for the walls going up and tariffs is going to be the auto sector. And according to estimates this morning from the Financial Times, China's electric vehicle sales are expected to exceed traditional car sales in the country for the first time next year. Meanwhile, sales of internal combustion engine cars are expected to fall by more than 10%. And we are very lucky to have Sarah this morning because you just got back from China. And you said you saw BYDs everywhere. Are they pervasive now in the Chinese economy?
I would say, so you have different colored license plates for EV cars versus regular cars. They're green versus blue, and I saw a lot of green license plates. Many of them were on BYD cars, which stands for Build Your Dreams, which I did not know until I went to China. And I would also say that there's an encouragement, there are factors encouraging EV purchases, which are you can drive more regularly. With ICE, you have to drive every other day as opposed to you can drive any day. And the tags, the cost of the tags for your car are much more expensive. If it's an EV, you can get a tag. If it's a non-EV, it's expensive to get a tag. So there's clearly incentives pushing towards the EV side. It is unclear to me exactly where everyone's charging those cars because those cities are very densely built, and I did not see a lot of charging stations. Apparently there are a lot of basement charging stations, but that is, I think, one of the issues for such a big place, which is how am I going to charge all these cars? But there's definitely incentives pushing people into electric vehicles.
How much faster is China moving? These EV sales is set to overtake traditional cars years ahead of what the United States or Europe with the West is trying to achieve.
Well, I think in a lot of cases, when you look at an accelerated build out like their highway system and even people owning automobiles, right? Like let's look back at the history. It was not, the auto sales have been much higher in the last decade or two than they had been historically. So I think that you are in a position where you've accelerated a lot of that. And if you are going to incentivize, to the extent that they're incentivizing it, to own an EV, there's really also a question of what is the level of sales versus the level of sales in the last few years. But I think it's not a surprise because those incentives are so strong to be in EV vehicles.
Also, a BYD car is as low as $10,000 you can get one for. All right, from autos to airlines, Japan Airlines was forced to halt ticket sales and delay flights due to a cyber attack this morning. Ticket sales are back up and running after being halted as a result of the incident. The company said systems have been restored without any leakage of customer data, and there is no virus damage. This, of course, comes after American Airlines experienced a brief ground stop on all U.S. flights on Christmas Eve due to a technical issue it blamed on a third-party vendor. I think we just need to get more used to this.
I think, unfortunately, I mean, it's one of the reasons that people have been going into and continuing to stay in security stocks is that there are so many vulnerabilities because a lot of these systems are older, and in some cases there are many systems that are working together for larger airlines. And I think the vulnerability of that is becoming more clear when things like this happen. Because as soon as I heard the Japan Airlines, I thought of the American Airlines issue that happened the other day because, of course, we all heard about that because it was such a big travel day. So I think that there is definitely a need for people to be looking at this on a more regular basis.
Nothing says Christmas like flight delays. Ukraine's war against Russia sees no sign of stopping anytime soon, something we'll be tracking going into 2025, with Russia launching a large-scale missile attack on Ukraine's energy infrastructure yesterday. Bloomberg's David Gura sat down with U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen earlier this month and asked her about the future U.S. sanctions against Russia.
We never preview sanctions, and we've constantly been tightening our sanctions on Russia. Our overall aim is to impair Russia's ability to continue conducting this brutal war, to try to deny it the military equipment. It needs to be able to do that, and we've taken a variety of steps to do it. But we have been focused since the outset on Russian oil revenue. It's a critical component of the Russian budget, and we've been looking for creative ways to try to reduce Russia's revenue. One of the most creative policymaking things that I've been involved at during my career occurred here in Treasury when we were able to devise a way and convince our allies to join us in this, imposing a price cap on Russian oil, which was a way of avoiding price spikes when the war started for oil, and actually succeeded in keeping Russian oil flowing into the market. So we continue to look, of course, over time. While these sanctions have been effective, Russia has invested a lot its own fleet of ships to carry its own oil. We cut it off from allied ships. New insurance that have been costly to Russia to have to make those investments. Now, what's unusual about this moment is that the oil market seems to be well supplied.
Prices are relatively cheap.
Prices are relatively low. Global demand is down, and there really has been an increase in supply. American firms have stepped up. We have vastly expanded oil production. OPEC countries like Saudi Arabia have excess capacity at this time. So the global oil market is softer, and that creates possibly an opportunity to take some further action. We're looking at it.
You talked about creative policy making, and so vis-a-vis Ukraine, there was a moment this week when you dispersed $20 billion to Ukraine alone, and that'll be paid for with interest on frozen Russian assets. So another creative piece of policy making that you've been involved with. We're at this moment where I think there are a lot of questions about what policies can remain in place. And I wonder, when you look at that in particular, are you confident that under a new administration, that program can continue in perpetuity?
Well, we have worked with, if you're talking about the so-called ERA loans, extraordinary acceleration loans, we've now transferred $20 billion, which is the United States contribution to this loan package to the World Bank, to a financial intermediary fund that was set up to channel these monies over time in coordination with our allies to Ukraine as it's needed. So, and as you mentioned, importantly, this is not using U.S. taxpayer resources. These loans will be paid off over time by the extraordinary or windfall revenues that are being earned in Europe at Euroclear on the Russian assets that are being frozen there. So Russia is really helping with this to pay Ukraine to help it fight the war. So I feel confident that this is something that can stay in place. And what we're really trying to do is to strengthen Ukraine's situation, its ability to defend itself, and hopefully at some point to come to the table to bargain with Russia for a just peace. We want to strengthen its ability to have the equipment it needs, to have the money it needs to, continue to finance schooling and emergency services to its people, and to put it in the best possible situation to support a lasting and just peace.
Bloomberg's David Gura speaking with U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Part of that conversation was about maybe more sanctions on Russian crude. And I and some of my colleagues down in D.C. had this reporting that before Biden leaves office, they might actually go after Russian crude outright, not going through the price cap. Do you think any of this could be, a premium added to the oil prices?
I think anything where people start talking about getting more serious about it can have a short-term effect. But I think what we've found collectively is that oil is a fungible good. So you can put restrictions in different places, but the fact is it tends to move anyway because it's a very high-value cargo, right? So I think if there is a stricter regime about it, you might see a move in the price in the short term, but you've also got OPEC basically holding back a little production because there hasn't been that much of a shortage that people were looking for because of the combination of sanctions and because people thought that demand was going to be higher. So you've got a little bit of a tension that's going on there. So I don't know that that would necessarily be sustainable. I think you need a higher demand picture before that happens.
Right, there's a ton of spare capacity. I think Saudi Arabia, UAE would be excited to start filling some of those gaps. All right, let's get you an update on other stories we're watching elsewhere this morning. Here's your Bloomberg Brief with Yahira Hackis. Hey, Yahira.
Hi, Anne-Marie. Turkey lowering interest rates for the first time in almost 2 years by 250 basis points after consumer inflation showed some signs of easing. The central bank's decision was unexpected by some analysts who were divided on the size of the cut or didn't expect one. until next year. Medium forecasts in a Bloomberg survey of analysts saw a cut of 175 basis points. Meanwhile, shares of Toyota rallied for their biggest two-day advance since August. Analysts expect the car maker to post higher return on equity following a report that the firm is planning to double its target. The stock gained 6% in Tokyo after a double-digit two-day climb. And Kansas City celebrating Christmas this year by locking up the AFC's top playoff seed. Star quarterback Patrick Mahomes threw 3 touchdown passes to score a 29-10 victory over the Pittsburgh Steelers. Meanwhile, Coach Andy Reid stunned the locker room with a Santa outfit to celebrate their Christmas win. That's your Bloomberg Brief. Anne-Marie?
Yeah, Hira, you and I should have celebrated surveillance this morning with Santa Claus outfits. Get this when it comes to the NFL and Netflix. The Atlantic just putting this out. After Netflix agreed to pay $150 million to broadcast 2 NFL games on Christmas, that's $50 million more than producing a season of Game of Thrones for 2 games. And that's what we're going to be talking about next. Netflix push for streaming dominance.
Let's start with, looking into 2025, we're feeling really good about the business. We had a plan to re-accelerate growth, and we delivered on that plan.
That's coming up next. You're watching Bloomberg Surveillance.
You missed it on Bloomberg, the China show.
What's been the sentiment? What's been the reaction to this U.S. election outcome on the ground?
They were pretty much ready for Donald Trump. There was a high expectation that he could return to the White House. We have dealt with him before, and after quite a few years, China simply is better prepared, and China, psychologically speaking, is much more prepared in dealing with him again.
Probably are fully prepared for Trump to impose higher tariffs on China.
What's the tone as they were talking to really a global investment?
Right. The openness of China, including the capital markets, Hong Kong being an international financial center will be extremely important in channeling global investors.
Don't miss the China Show live every weekday.
Jumpstart your trading day on Bloomberg Open Interest.
2 hours of single stock stories that are driving the opening bell action. We'll take you to Wall Street, Main Street, the C-suite, and beyond.
These are companies that are growing their market.
The great companies in the U.S. are the companies hitting the cutting edge. That's a different story.
Get the inside track on what's buzzing in markets.
With the players who are shaping the narrative.
If you have bad earnings reports, you're going to get punished.
They're not buying what the industry is selling. Join us on Bloomberg Open Interest. Weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern, only on Bloomberg.
As we spend some time here on the broader presidential race.
Let's focus in on European politics.
Makes you wonder how politics might play out.
Bringing you up-to-the-minute financial news whenever and wherever it happens. I'm Michael McKee at the Federal Reserve, and this is Bloomberg.
Good morning and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance. On this holiday week, I'm Amber Herdern. John and Lisa are still off. What we're seeing across equity markets today, futures are softer. Santa Paws Rally. I love how a guest wrote that in. Santa Paws Rally, not the Santa Claus Rally, although we still have a few days left for the rest of the year, so potentially it can turn around. And still, the S&P 500 is up more than 20% on the year. Eurodollar this morning, 103. Yields, though, are climbing, now up 4 basis points. 10-year yield, 4.62%. And New York crude a little bit firmer, $70.52. Under surveillance this morning, Netflix push for streaming dominance.
Let's start with, looking into 2025, we're feeling really good about the business. We had a plan to re-accelerate growth, and we delivered on that plan. You can see that in our 2024 financials. We expect to deliver 15% revenue growth and 6 percentage points of operating margin improvement. And engagement, which we view as our best proxy for member happiness, because when people watch more, they stick around longer, so that's retention.
Here's the latest Netflix Christmas Day NFL debut going off without a glitch, highlighted by a Beyoncé star-studded halftime performance. Jason Bazinet of Citi has a neutral rating on Netflix, noting, quote, ad tier optimism seems priced in. Jason joins us now. So Jason, they did pretty well when it comes to the NFL yesterday. No massive glitches, even though I heard the games weren't that exciting. Beyoncé, though, got everyone very excited. Do you think we're going to see more of this style from Netflix, diving deeper into live events?
Oh, 100%. I'll just give you some simple metrics just to sort of frame it for your viewers. Netflix, the consumer pays about a half a cent a minute to watch Netflix today. On the old legacy linear side, you pay about a penny a minute. And just the advertising revenue Netflix is going to generate off these games is probably a penny a minute. And if I go to something like the Super Bowl, you generate 2 cents a minute of ad revenue. So what they're doing is sort of moving up the value chain in terms of where consumers derive more utility, and they'll keep moving in this direction.
So Jason, why do you have a neutral rating on it?
Oh my gosh, this stock is up almost 100% this year, and I
know,
can explain
90%. It's unbelievable.
90%. I can explain about half of it. So they had upward earnings revisions that were worth about 20% this year. The street also rolled forward from 25 to 26 estimates. That's reasonable. That's worth another 25%. The balance, that other sort of 40-ish percent, I can't explain. There's nothing fundamental in the results that have transpired that warrant that sort of multiple expansion. So the street, if you talk to the buy side, they were sort of penciling in 25 times EPS. Now they're at 30 times on 26 numbers. You know, could the multiple go to 35 times or 40 times? Sure, it could. But we're just not seeing anything that is fundamentally that different that would warrant a higher multiple other than just market euphoria.
Is this one of those situations where the moat aspect of what Netflix does, as in we've sort of taken this piece and we are now dominant in the space, people are paying for the exclusivity that Netflix is? Because we look at multiples across a variety of areas, and you think that there's some real strength in those. And even if they came down a few turns, they still wouldn't be cheap. But I think as some of these giant tech guys get bigger, they become, I am the one in the space, right? So you see that a little bit with Booking, you see it with Amazon. So is it just, I'm just paying for that exclusivity, and right now mega cap tech is winning, versus there's something specific going on with Netflix, and you know they're cash generative when they weren't for a long time, and there's growth there, but it does seem a little outsized relative to the actual fundamentals.
Yeah, I mean, the buy side does have this winner take most in a lot of these tech names. And that's certainly affecting Netflix's multiple. The thing that is a little bit strange to me is that that was true in 21, 22, 23, 24. It'll still be true in 25, but nothing has fundamentally widened the gap between Netflix as the leader and the rest of the industry. If anything, I would argue that a lot of their streaming peers have actually begun to turn the corner and have started generating profits. Not of the quantum that Netflix has, but if anything, the gap has tightened a bit.
Well, when you see things like YouTube raising their prices, and you see areas where it's becoming more expensive to have these, you know, we're going to liberate ourselves from cable and it will be cheaper. And now all the individual pieces are getting more expensive again. So does that maybe put Netflix in a better space, just because if people start to pare things down, it's not necessarily going to be the first thing to go, and or watching rivals up their prices and up them dramatically, does that help them when they're upping their prices as they go along? Because the switch was different, and the password sharing deletions were different, and now you've got other areas where they can raise their prices.
Yeah, that's 100% true. So if you talk to the bulls on the stock, they would say, look, Netflix is still cheap relative to linear. We talked about the half a cent a minute versus the penny a minute for linear TV. So that's undeniably true. The bulls also say, hey, look at all the other streamers. They've raised their prices, so Netflix should raise their prices as well. If you ask management about either of those two prongs, they just frown and shake their head and say, no, that's not how we look at it. Netflix looks at it in terms of what you just played in your clip, engagement. If the engagement is up, they feel like they've earned the right to raise prices. And so that's why they're pushing into sports. Their engagement levels, their share of streaming has really been flat over the last 18 months, even as the quantum of content spend continues to go up. So what is this? What is sports designed to do? It's to pursue a different vector where maybe the content cost per hour is more expensive, but the consumer response in terms of engagement will be much deeper.
It is more expensive. The Athletic posted this, Jason. Netflix agreed to pay $150 million to broadcast 2 NFL games on Christmas. $50 million more than producing a season of Game of Thrones for just 2 games. Is that worth the money?
It is worth the money. It's because consumers value sports much more than they value scripted or unscripted content. I used to go on TV years ago, and this is when the pay TV bills were rising, and the common narrative was, oh, it's sports' fault. It's ESPN's fault. That's why the consumer bill keeps going up. And I would always say, no, you have it exactly backwards. The thing that's underpriced in the old linear bundle was sports wasn't expensive enough. It was sports that sort of caused the consumer to pay the $100 a month for pay TV. It wasn't all of the other stuff. And so our preferred way to sort of think about Netflix's push into sports is not to buy Netflix. It's to buy the actual sports leagues that you can buy. That's where the value is actually going to accrue. The value of sports rights will continue to go up.
Jason, thank you so much for your time this morning. Merry Christmas and happy holidays to you and your family. Jason Bazinet of Citi. Stunning year when it comes to Netflix, Sarah. I'm absolutely just struck by this factoid that we basically could have produced another season of Game of Thrones and had money left over. As we end out the hour, though, we'll love to get your thoughts for a piece of advice going into 2025.
I think just be braced for some volatility and understand that the markets, you've had 2 great years of equity performance, and that you are going to see some volatility, and that is not the end of the world. We sort of need a little bit of some type of moderation on the valuation front before people get really excited. But at the same time, there's still some good growth, and there's still some real performance to be had out of equities eventually. But don't be afraid if you start to see a little bit of wonkiness.
Sounds like glass half full going into 2025. Sarah Hunt, thank you so much for joining us this hour. Coming up in the program, Jay Pulaski of TBW, Andrew Obin of Bank of America, and Joe Brusuelas of RSM, and Chen Zhao of Redfin. You're watching Bloomberg Surveillance on this shortened holiday week. Thank you so much for spending your morning with us. 1 more hour of Bloomberg Surveillance, including jobless claims, coming up at 8:30.
In 2015, I was not optimistic because nobody was working on the hard problems. The energy R&D budgets had gone down. The venture investing in climate had gone down. It was completely out of fashion. So I don't know what people were optimistic about then. The fact is, we built essentially from scratch, with lots of supporters, a really mind-blowing level of innovation against emissions. And in the last 9 years, that's gone better than I would have expected. So only now could you even, plausibly be optimistic about the path of emissions. And someone who said, hey, nobody's ever scaled things up like the speed that we knew to before, they're welcome to say, hey, I'll believe this when I see it. In the meantime, some people who care about this issue are really out, trying to think, do we need permitting reform? Do we find, what new ideas haven't we found yet? How do we fund people with those new ideas? How do we get the costs of these things down? How do we collaborate on a global basis? So we're still not at the point where it's guaranteed or even that it'll be easy, but at least there's a theory of change.
Top names at the Fed are on Bloomberg.
The median projection is 2 rate cuts next year. That makes sense to me, but we have to remain agile. Every meeting is live from the standpoint that you're debating, you're discussing, you're thinking what's the right level of policy. But my projection is that it will take many fewer rate cuts next year than we thought, but I'll watch the economy and see if that works out.
Nobody covers the Fed like Bloomberg.
You talked about how governments are not looking at healthcare and investing in healthcare as much as they should. What's the message you'd like to send to those governments?
Well, I think a healthier population is always going to be more productive. It's just that sometimes the political will isn't there in some of these countries. So I hope that they can keep this as a priority, because a workforce that is 20 or 30% down during a pandemic or an outbreak, or there's certain diseases that keep spreading, is not healthy, it's not productive. And if you want everyone to perform at their best and you want healthcare costs to be down, you don't want to be burdened with insurance costs and other costs, I think it's important to invest early in health, in child health, in women's health, and I hope that continues both in India and other parts.
Asia is at the forefront of some of the world's biggest stories. I'm Chevrian in Tokyo.
And I'm Heidi Stroud-Watts here in Sydney, where the trading day begins. We're here in the center of all the action to get you set up with the numbers, news, and knowledge you need for the day ahead.
The demand is indeed recovering. We've been waiting for this moment.
The opportunity of a century.
Join us on Bloomberg The Asia Trade. Weekdays only on Bloomberg TV. Context changes everything.
Your fixed income fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield every Friday at 12 p.m. Eastern, right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
As far as the stock market, I'd say it's reasonably priced for another decent year.
There's just been a lot more kind of idiosyncratic risk out there. Volatility is kind of a little bit all over the place.
What tends to happen, though, in January is all the sort of market moves that we have in December get completely unwound.
We're going through a nominal regime shift to a higher nominal GDP condition.
We trust the data, but we take it with a grain of salt. We look at a broad measure of every type of indicator.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Farrell, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
Good morning and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance, the final week of 2024, the day after Christmas. Thank you so much for spending it with me. Anne-Marie Hordern, John, and Lisa are still off. Joining me this hour is Jay Pulaski of TPW Advisory. Jay, you've been with us on some big moments of 2024. As we round out this year, what do you make of all of it?
Well, it's been a great year for an investor, right? I mean, the S&P up 25, 28%. So who can complain, right? And now we are changing governments. We are starting to look abroad. I mean, our view is that we're early in what we call the long cycle, right? And we have a global bull market in equities, and we have a global growth cycle, and they're complementary, and they reinforce each other through the earnings cycle. And so for us, we're really looking at opportunities now outside the U.S. We think we're going to shift. The equity market's going to broaden out. Global growth is going to broaden out. And the opportunity set really is more attractively valued, under-owned, upcycle in growth and earnings in the non-U.S. market. So we're really thinking about shifting from U.S., which has been the leader, to the non-U.S. markets.
All right, hold those thoughts. We're going to dive into more of them in just a moment. As Jay said, of course, the S&P 500 has had a fantastic year, up more than 25%. Futures, though, this morning, on this Thursday morning, are pulling back. We are seeing red across the future screen. S&P 500 futures there, down 0.3%. Euro dollar back at 104. I keep coming back to the fact that we started the year with euro dollar around 110. So we've just seen the U.S. dollar in an absolute tear, but also a lot of problems right now happening in Europe. Yields climbing this morning, up more than 3 basis points, 4.62%. on the 10-year yield. T. Rowe Price looking for something like 5, maybe even 6% in 2025. And New York crude firmer, more than $70 a barrel on NYMEX crude. Coming up this hour, Andrew Obin of BofA Securities on the outlook for industrials amid Trump's tariff threats. Joe Brasuelis of RSM reacting to the final jobless claims data of the year. That's coming up in about 30 minutes. And Chen Zhao of Redfin Economics on the state of the housing market going into next year. We begin this hour with stocks on track for their second straight year of 20% plus gains. Jay Pawlowski is bullish going into the new year, saying, quote, "We continue to expect single-digit type upside for U.S. equities next year, but we think there is a reasonable chance that at the same time, investor concerns over the likely policy chaos in D.C. could lead to investor outflows from heavily over-owned U.S. assets, resulting in USD weakness, which would further support commodities and EM assets." And Jay, I'm so excited, is going to join us for the next 60 minutes. So what you're saying there, what it sounds like is almost 2024 was the peak when it comes to U.S. exceptionalism. Is that accurate?
Well, it could be, right? I mean, U.S. has led. I mean, it's one of the things that's interesting. We talked about those big moments, right? One of them was election night, where we talked about the great economic story of the Biden administration did not translate politically. But clearly, the U.S. is the global growth leader, best performer on inflation, and yet now we're looking at a situation where we think there's uncertainty in the U.S. With the new administration. The rest of the world is responding, right? We're in what we call, as we touched on at the top, the long cycle. It's really being driven by competition within our tripolar world thesis of regional competition between Asia, Europe, and the Americas in the three areas of climate, AI, and defense. And that competition requires a new industrial policy. So we're talking about the marriage of fiscal and monetary policy, and it has to be done well, right? And so you really have to start putting a premium on the policymakers and their ability to be in alignment with public and private sector. And we see that in China, right? You were talking earlier about the EVs. China led the way in the climate space, and they now dominate the entire space. So now the fight is in AI, and people are throwing money at this. Every government, every company in the world needs to compete in AI. And so these investments are too big for any one company. That's why the governments have to get involved. That's why we have fiscal spending. But you have to do it well. And if you don't do it well, the markets rebel, as we're seeing in Brazil, right? 9-10% fiscal deficit, currency collapsing, rates skyrocketing, and equities underperforming. And so there really is this competition, and we think we're shifting now where the rest of the world has to respond. So you have deflation in China, you have stagnation in Europe, and so we're seeing policy mixes responding now to those issues, and we see President-elect Trump as an accelerator of that, right? I mean, he's threatening tariffs on everybody, so people, China in particular, export-led economy. If they don't start to drive domestic consumption, they're more at risk to being held hostage by the U.S. And so they are responding. And one of the great unknowns, we talk about the U.S. and the S&P. Guess what? China is outperforming the U.S., right? FXI, the large cap China ETF, is up 29% year to date, outperforming the S&P. Nobody knows about that. Nobody talks about that, but that's the reality. So it's already starting to happen. And so our view is that year 3 in a bull market, which is what we're in the U.S. and globally, tends to be a kind of rest year. Single-digit type returns are the average for 3-year bull markets. So as we see global growth picking up outside the U.S., we think we're going to see earnings do better outside the U.S. than in the U.S. That's new, particularly in emerging markets. And therefore, we think investors can start to take profits in the U.S., particularly if there's uncertainty with the new Trump administration, and allocate to the non-U.S. markets, which are completely underowned at like 50-year lows in relative valuation, starting to pick up earnings growth, starting to do the right policy mix. So that's the opportunity. Take some money off the table in the U.S., move it into the non-U.S., markets, and we think commodities as well. And so there's really that pause. So year 3 in the U.S. bull market, single-digit earnings growth. That's what we're driving with our single-digit return expectation. And then non-U.S. markets can go up 15%, 18%, earnings growth, economic growth. You know, investors start to allocate. There you go.
Let's look at China a little bit more, though. I know the equity market there, you say, is doing very well, but the economy there is still struggling. Don't you think? I mean, you look at youth
5% growth.
You look at consumer healthy or not, consumer demand, it's not really there. I mean, at some point, do you think China is going to come out with an even bigger bazooka when it comes to fiscal demand?
Well, a lot of it, as we've talked about, Emery, is what's in the price, right? And, you know, the China stimulus, they are taking out the left tail risk. They've told you months ago that they're not going to let the equity market go down. And guess what? They have the ability to do that. And so they're doing it. And so as an investor, you know, when you look at single-digit PE, which is what, you know, China trades on, when you look at the government saying, we're going to stimulate the economy. When you look at the tech stuff, right? So the U.S. is trying to freeze China out of the high-end tech so it could lead in AI. That's the game. The way we look at that is that's an opportunity to buy China tech, which is now going to dominate the China, the China e-commerce market, which is much bigger than the U.S., growing much faster than the U.S., and the companies that dominate them are trading at like a 60% discount to the U.S. peer group. And so we're long China tech because we think that's really where the opportunity is. And as we said before, China knows it has to act because it's struggling with deflation, right? The property sector has been a big problem. By the way, it's bottoming. You can start, the data is starting to finally show properties starting to pick up a little bit in China. And now we have a situation where they are threatened by President Trump with exports, okay? They're an export-led economy. They need to switch that export focus to domestic demand focus, and that's what they are doing. So stimulus, stimulus, stimulus. Not a huge bazooka. We don't expect that. But stimulus, 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 more stimulus coming in the spring, and therefore, you know, growing at 5%, earnings growth needs to pick up. So that's important. Earnings growth has been disappointing in China, but we think it's going to pick up, and as it does, stocks are completely underowned. Nobody owns China. I mean, I saw something, and I can't remember which firm because, you know, so many year-ahead outlooks. And I think there was a list of like 15 major banks, and not a single one thought China growth was going to be better in 2025 than it is in 2024. I love that. You know, when everybody is thinking one thing, we like to go the other way.
Right, when everyone's on one side of the boat,
Yes.
you lean the other way.
Yes.
Okay, so we talked about China. This idea that potentially they'll have domestic consumption, try to boost it. At the same time, many say that with the walls going up around the United States, they dump more on Europe. Can Europe handle that?
Yeah, Europe is a challenge, right? So in our tripolar world, you have China leading because they're the best at marrying this industrial policy, fiscal and monetary, public and private. They've shown that with the climate space, right? U.S. responds with Biden's CHIP Act, Infrastructure Act, IRA Act, and now we're in the game. Best growth of the G7. And now where is Europe? So Europe has to respond. They know it. You know, there's report after report, the Draghi report, this, that, and the other. They know what they have to do. It's a matter of political will. And I think you're going to see that political kind of logjam break this spring in Germany. Germany is the, you know, the engine of Europe, and it's been going nowhere for years, okay, in part because Germany has not gone down the fiscal stimulus route that pretty much every other major economy has. They have the famous debt brake, right? Very strict on how much debt they can issue. So guess what? They now understand they have to kind of fudge that a little bit, and they need to stimulate to get their economy to pick up because they, too, like China, are very export dependent. And their export dependency is on China. So China's weak consumption really hurts Germany, all right? So we expect in the upcoming election, right, the government has failed. We wrote a piece last week in our musings. It was called Vote of No Confidence, right? Because there's so many no confidence votes. And Germany had one. New government we expect in the spring, going to be led by the more conservative side of Europe, German political space, and we think they are going to lead the talk about easing on the debt brake. So we expect fiscal stimulus in Germany next year, in Europe more broadly, and we think that is going to help attract capital to the European assets.
How behind are they potentially going to be, though?
Well,
Donald Trump is being inaugurated January 20th, and he has a very different view on Europe than the Biden administration.
Well, I mean, look, I think the tariff thing is overstated. Let me just go back to the Europe and Germany 1 sec. Really, the auto companies show it, right? That is the leading edge of European manufacturing, and they are getting their heads handed to them all around the world, but especially in China. So they know, they understand, they have got to act, and they're going to act. On the tariff side, I think the markets are telling you that for the most part, it's already in the price. Right? Trump came out 25% on Mexico, on Canada, more on China.
He's already negotiating.
Right, but here's the thing. It's not the news, it's the reaction to the news that counts. And you look at the reaction to these markets, there was no reaction. No reaction. Peso higher after a week, China stocks higher after a week, Europe no stocks, no action. So I think the tariffs for the most part are in the price.
Jay Pulaski, thank you so much, and you'll be sticking with us for the next 16 minutes. That's Jay Pulaski of TPW Advisory. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning. Here's your Bloomberg Brief with Yahira Hackis. Hey, Yahira.
Hi, Anne-Marie. President-elect Donald Trump has tapped Miami-Dade County Commissioner Kevin Marino Cabrera as ambassador to Panama. Cabrera worked for the Trump campaign in the 2020 presidential election and won Trump's endorsement when he ran for vice chairman of the Florida Republican Party in January. Cabrera has his work cut out for him as Trump calls for the U.S. to regain control over the Panama Canal. Meanwhile, Bitcoin reversing earlier gains, though it is up on the month after the digital assets stockpiler MicroStrategy announced the plan to issue more shares in a move that would allow it to buy even more tokens. But MicroStrategy raised some eyebrows earlier this week when it announced it had purchased more Bitcoin, but it was its smallest purchase to date and at a very high price, which is unusual for the company known to strategically buy the token on the dip. And Elon Musk's deputy, Steve Davis, is helping recruit staff for President-elect Donald Trump's Department of Government Efficiency, also known as DOGE. This is in addition to Davis's day job as president of Musk's tunneling startup, The Boring Company. Davis has helped Musk cut costs at businesses, including SpaceX and social media platform X. That's your Bloomberg Brief. Anne-Marie?
Thanks so much, Yahira. Up next, we're going to be sticking with President-elect Trump and preparing for Trump's tariffs.
I think what you're seeing is a pull forward, so it's taking share from the future, that people are trying to get goods in before a potential strike or tariffs.
That conversation coming up next. You're watching Bloomberg Surveillance.
Good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
Welcome back to the opening trade.
This is Bloomberg Technology.
This is the Asia Trade.
This is Wall Street Week. Welcome to Balance of Power.
This is Bloomberg.
Morning. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda.
Taking you from the U.S. market's close to the overnight session in Asia. We'll walk you through what you need to know to kickstart the European trading day. Live from our European headquarters, we bring you the day's top market-moving stories, unmatched expert analysis, and on-the-ground reporting from across the continent. Tune in to Daybreak Europe, only on Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything. From the world of politics to the world of business, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines deliver news, insight, and analysis live 2 times a day every trading day. Balance of Power at 1 and 5 Eastern, only on Bloomberg.
Good morning and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance, the final week of 2024. We are seeing markets pull back ever so slightly, softer on S&P 500 futures, but an incredible year with S&P 500 up more than 25% this year. Eurodollar sitting around 104. Yields, though, climbing this morning, up nearly 4 basis points on the 10-year. You're looking at a 10-year yield of 4.62%. Under surveillance this morning, preparing for Trump's tariffs.
I think what you're seeing is a pull forward, so it's taking share from the future. That people are trying to get goods in before a potential strike or tariffs. That if you're concerned about those things, which you should be, and you have the option, you have the flexibility in your supply chain. You want to get the goods in as soon as possible to avoid the disruption. The big thing right now is the uncertainty. It's like, what exactly is going to hit? When is it going to hit? How is it going to hit?
Here's the latest. President-elect Donald Trump proposing tariffs on Canada, Mexico, China, and the European Union, resulting in more questions than answers about how his administration will implement them and how fast. Andrew Obin of Bank of America Securities writing this. Overall, tariffs are likely manageable for multi-industrials. That said, we believe tariffs would be a negative headline for our stocks, and there's a potential for a price-cost air pocket. Andrew joins us now. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us. So explain that air cost.
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, roughly 20% of COGS for multi-industrials are imported goods. So from that perspective, as you start putting in tariffs, you have to price for them. And the question is, how long does it takes for the pricing to go through? Last time was interesting. Stocks actually did go down on these negative headlines in 18 and 19, right? Remember, but those were China-oriented, right? We had 25% tariff on $200 billion worth of goods imported from China. Then we did another 10% on $300 billion in 2019. And if you actually track the stock reactions on that day, and if you traded that basket, I think on a cumulative basis, stocks underperformed by 16 percentage points on the days the tariffs have been announced. However, this time it doesn't seem like the market cares too much.
Why is that? Why is the market just brushing it off?
I think it's complacency. I actually think, I do think longer term, what people saw last time is that the companies were able to implement price increases to offset that. So, for example, if you think about 20% of COGS, takes 1.3 percentage point of price to offset that, and 1.6 percentage point of price for you not to even see it in the margin. So from that perspective, what we've learned over the past 4 or 5 years during COVID, right, very inflationary companies are a lot better in putting pricing in. So I think people just think companies have developed this pricing muscle to put that in.
So, Andrew, is there one part of the world that's better positioned to deal with tariffs? Like, is China better prepared, or is Europe better prepared, or do you think everyone's kind of equally unprepared?
I would say it's more, our comment is more about investors, right? Because you sort of think that tariffs don't matter. When we talk, so I cover a truck distributor, and you talk to them, and they source trucks from Mexico, and they source trucks from Canada. They actually, this is like real operational stuff. They have no clue what's going to happen the day the tariffs go in. So I think the market is missing also that part about the actual disruption when that happens. Yes, they'll put in pricing, right? But, you talk to the executives, and they're a bit at a loss as to what's going to happen the day of the tariffs, because they have to manage in the real world, right? Right. For these numbers to show up, for this pricing to show up that quarter, quarter later, actions have to be taken, right? And then there are supply chain disruptions. I think it's actually the nuts and bolts of tackling whatever disruptions there are, if there are, in fact, tariffs in place.
Right. So, because it's interesting, because I had the view, and I expressed it a few minutes ago, that, I think markets have already kind of priced in the tariffs. So I'm on a different wavelength than you. So it's interesting, your view.
Yeah, I would not disagree. So we published this year ahead report, and then we surveyed investor sentiment. Nobody cares about tariffs. I think it's actually very fair. Investors are very complacent about tariffs. I think that's the part that concerns me, right? I do think they're manageable. I think it will take 1 to 2 quarters to fully offset tariffs with pricing. We are in the inflationary environment. The companies have gotten way better at putting in pricing. But what happens right? That quarter when you miss numbers on tariffs.
Right, so I want to get to that because you talked about your basket and what happens, the underperformance if you bought on that day. I'm curious, have you done work on like 3 months or 6 months or 9 months later? Was that actually a buying opportunity?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, the background for our call is that we have the best CapEx cycle, probably in 20 years. And obviously, tariffs is part of the policy. The U.S. government decided, since the 50s or 60s, we finally have an industrial policy, right? And the industrial policy, the gist of it, we're not going to deindustrialize. And from that perspective, what it means, I think it is very fair that investors are taking this view. Look, this is part of this much broader thesis. Story, if you look, between 2007 and 2019, I think U.S. CapEx has grown 3%. If you look in the past 5 years, it has compounded at 7%. Now, part of it is inflation, but obviously we report numbers. Earnings are with inflation.
Exactly.
So that matters. We probably will end 24 with 9% CapEx growth. 25 is going to be another year of high single-digit CapEx growth, right? So tariffs are disruptive, but they are driving this massive, massive structural change in CapEx in North America, right, driven by semis. But what's also interesting is that semis is dragging along with it huge, huge part of the supply chain.
Andrew, do you have a time frame on when we could see the sanctions, the tariffs?
No, I honestly don't, right? You don't know what's going to happen after January 20th.
So companies are struggling to prepare.
Well, I think it's the uncertainty. It's exactly right. Going back to the example of the distributor I gave you, right? They source trucks from Mexico, source trucks from Canada. What happens the day off, right? Because they have to go to their customers. They have agreements signed. So how do they deal with that, right? They have to go to their customers. They have to explain what happens. I do think the managements are a lot more ready. We had a dinner recently with the CEO, and we asked him, how long will it take you to put in tariffs? And he said, I'll put them on day one. I'll put in pricing day one to fully offset. I'm not going to apologize. I think the upside is that we are coming off this highly inflationary environment, right, where companies have absolutely developed this pricing muscle, which was not there in 1819, which was right at the tail end of this big deflationary cycle.
When you're looking into next year, 2024, you talk about secular themes like electrical, data centers, grid. What do you expect some of those themes to be going into 2024?
Oh, we think the theme is very simple. It's PMI. PMIs have been down for 2 years. There are multiple reasons. There are technical reasons, definitional reasons why they were down. I don't think it really reflects how weak the industrial economy is, but history tells you if you have PMI going over 50, if we don't have a recession, PMIs go over 50. I think since the 60s, average outperformance has been 9 percentage points. Average absolute performance has been 20% plus. So I think investors are just waiting for the PMI to turn over 50. And I think that's probably the biggest theme into 2025. We expect that to happen maybe sometime in April. Having said that, I would say grid story is probably the biggest visibility story we have over the next decade. Decades and decades of underinvestment, and you have the confluence of reshoring and hence, tariffs, right? You have electrification, you have EVs, you have data centers, right? All of this comes together. So to us, grid epitomizes the confluence of all these mega trends that you talk about, and you really do have visibility for the next decade, because the last time we invested in the grid was in the 60s and 70s. And the stuff is just getting old and it's falling apart.
Andrew, thank you so much for your time this morning. Interesting stuff. Andrew Obin of Bank of America Research saying investors may be complacent when it comes to the upcoming potential tariffs. Coming up next, the final U.S. jobless claims print of the year, and Joe Brusuelas of RSM breaks down the data for us. You're watching Bloomberg Surveillance.
names in global leadership are on Bloomberg.
When it comes to tariffs, we need to be very clear. The European Union is negotiating as a whole, so there's no room to have bilateral agreements. It's a core competency of the Commission. But speaking about the art of the deal, I think a deal can be made when it comes to the U.S.-European trade relations.
Nobody covers the top global leaders like Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Key investors, top executives, global innovators. Join me for in-depth conversations with the biggest newsmakers on the day's top stories. Insight with Haslinda Onen, only on Bloomberg.
Is on. Everything you need to get the edge at the end of the market day.
Big tech earnings kick off later this afternoon.
Gilead is coming out right now.
We have take two numbers. Back to the markets, right? Our bread and butter.
NVIDIA is one of the best stories in the tech space.
That actually matters a whole lot more.
It might shock some of your viewers.
You're watching The Close.
Get ahead of tomorrow's trading with The Close. Weekdays on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Good morning and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance. We're about 20 seconds away from the final U.S. jobless claims data of the year. Right now, what we're seeing across equity futures is a pullback. We are softer on the day. The last week of trading for 2024, we went into Christmas with a high. S&P 500 went into Christmas up more than 1%. Now we're pulling back 0.3%, but really not a ton of drama, as Jonathan Farrow would say on this Thursday morning. What we're seeing across yields, though, yields are climbing this morning. We have 4.6% on the 10-year yield, up more than 3 basis points. And we are seeing a little bit softer weakness on euro dollar. It's been a story of 2024, just absolute insatiable demand for the U.S. dollar. We have had that claims data drop, initial jobless claims, coming in at 219,000 for the initial jobless claims. The survey was for 223, so this is actually coming in lighter than expected. Prior month was 220K. We should remind you, claims data does tend to fluctuate, especially around the holidays, and you do see S&P futures there still are negative around 0.3%. Joining us now is Joe Brusuelas, chief economist at RSM. Joe, let's just get your first reaction to initial jobless claims, the final print for jobless claims of the year, coming in at 219,000.
Well, I think you laid the predicate there for me very well. Thank you, Anne-Marie. Good morning and happy holidays to everybody out there. You know, what we're seeing is a continuation of holiday noise. We get this time of the year. What I tend to do is look at the 13-week moving average, which was just above 220. So my sense is that we have gotten another status quo report. The U.S. economy continues to do well, and firms carefully manage their labor force, because as we head into next year, we do have not a risk to the downside. You know, we don't think that there's much risk of a recession next year, only 15%. We actually think the economy could outperform again, maybe even above 3%, and that would mean an acceleration in hiring. So we expect more of the same as we enter 2025.
When you look at the labor market, do you think right now the leverage is with the employer or the employee?
I think it's pretty finely balanced right now. It's no longer heavily tilted in favor of the employee like it was during the pandemic or in the initial recovery phase. My sense here, though, is that those days of very heady wage increases are behind us. We're really going to see 3.5% to 4%, I think, on a sustained basis. Now, if you're managing a firm out there in the real economy and you expect wage gains to reset to a pre-pandemic level, say of 2%, I suggest you might want to revisit those assumptions, because I just don't think that's where we're going to be for the foreseeable future.
Hey, Joe, Jay Pulaski here. You talk about 3% growth, which is well above potential. Are you worried about inflation next year?
All right, so the way we look at next year is our baseline was a 55% probability that the economy grows at 2.5% or better. But, as we accelerate into the close of the year, we're thinking about that alternative to the baseline, which was a 30% probability that the economy would grow at a 3% or greater pace. At that point, yeah, I would be concerned about an acceleration in inflation, not just because of the underlying fundamentals, but because of the policy adjustment that's going to go on in Washington. That's going to be some of the main variables that we're all going to have to solve for next year.
Yeah, and thinking about that a little bit, do you have a 10-year yield forecast? Because I'm curious what you think about the rates at that, if you do get that inflation.
For 2024, our forecast was 4.2 on average. Just before the show, I looked at the average on the 10-year is at 4.19. So we're very confident in our forecast for 2025. Right now, we thought we'd average 4.5% with risk of moving to 5% or higher. We thought the 10-year would trade somewhere between 4.3 and 4.70. So you look at that 4.6, and I think we're tentatively moving towards oversold conditions in the fixed income market. I think that, thin holiday trading conditions tend to cause things to melt up. And we've seen the stock market melt up over the past week, and we certainly have seen yields melt up. I don't necessarily think that's sustainable. I understand there's considerable uncertainty, and perhaps we should start talking about an uncertainty tax on fixed income. But my sense is that, yeah, you're going to see that 4.5% more or less next year. Now, you set me up there, so you open the door and I got to walk through. Should we move to 5% or higher? That's when things begin to break.
Right.
On top, around our very optimistic forecast on growth at somewhere between 2.5% and 3%. We do think that there's going to be some problems. Should yields on the 10-year move above 5% specifically in local and regional banks who are holding a disproportionate percentage, around 70% of commercial real estate loans? Some of those are simply just not performing right now as we continue to move through the adjustment in CRE. That's going to be one of the issues. And remember, the last time we moved above 5%, well, we had a mini bank run on those local and regional banks. The Fed had to step in and set up a liquidity facility. It'd be better if we didn't revisit that, in my estimation.
Do you think the bond market, specifically the 10-year yield, potentially around, if it were to trade near that 5% level yet again, will that be the ultimate check on some of the fiscal policies coming out of Washington?
Well, that's certainly going to be the discussion, isn't it, Anne-Marie, that the bond market's the last check on the expansionary fiscal policy of the new administration. One of the things that's not yet been really talked about to my satisfaction is the internal contradictions inside economic populism as it's practiced here in Washington. We're going to see tax cuts. We're likely to see an increase in government spending, most of it government financed, right? So you're going to see increased spending. You're going to see that stronger dollar. It's going to attract capital. But that's not going to rebalance the economy. In the bond market, we'll make a reassessment of the administration once we get the first set of concrete policy proposals. We're all basically thinking about this, but until you can see the whites of the eyes of the policy, it's going to be difficult to make a real hardcore assessment of where yield should be, where the dollar should be.
It's an interesting point because we do have some members of the FOMC, Joe, actually trying to make assumptions about what policy will look like next year. What did you make of that? Some members of the FOMC starting to pencil in what Trump policies might mean for 2025.
Well, I think it's appropriate that they begin to think about it. I didn't necessarily see it embedded in the forecast in the December summary of economic projections, but I think it's good that they begin to talk about it. When it comes down to what the Fed's going to do, I'll listen to Austin Goolsbee, Williams at New York Fed, and of course, Jay Powell. And Powell was very clear. Yeah, we're thinking about it, but we have not altered our forecast based on what's likely to happen. Now, from my point of view, I think the only thing that we can take as certain is that there's going to be tax cuts. The question is, are they going to be partially paid for, or are they going to be 100% financed? I happen to be here in Washington, D.C., visiting some relatives. It's one of the topics around the dinner table. My sense is that the majority next year will lean towards financing that, and that will point yields in a higher direction.
So, Joe, what does that do for the dollar? I'm curious. You had a great call there, obviously, on the 10-year. I imagine you have a view on the dollar. I'd love to hear it.
So we get a much stronger dollar for the first 6 months of the year against a trade-weighted basket of currencies. You're going to continue to see growth differentials and interest rate differentials drive the value of the greenback. The question is not will the dollar get strong, but will we get in a situation where the fundamental underlying strength of the U.S. economy, with that new policy piled on top of it, turns us into a situation where the dollar soars in the 80s and we get calls for dollar devaluation. The reason why I point that out is if you listen to what the incoming Treasury Secretary nominee has said over the past number of years, he clearly thinks that the dollar is overvalued. So we'll have to wait and see. And of course, the ultimate decider, President-elect Trump, he doesn't want to see dollar valuation. So we're going to see policy perhaps at cross currents, and we'll have to see which one wins out. But I would expect the dollar to gain against the euro, the yen, especially the peso, the loonie in particular, as well as a number of other currencies. Let me give you one you want to watch. Indian rupee. Now that's at or near all-time lows as that economy decelerates from somewhere near 7 to 10% to somewhere probably closer to 5%. That's indicative of what's going on in emerging markets where we could have a shakeout. You know, Jay, one of the interesting things is through mid-year, interest rate differentials and growth differentials have driven capital flows into a particularly interesting situation where capital flows in the United States are larger than the next 12 economies combined. That's something that's not sustainable and will create issues for emerging markets as we all adjust to the new policy environment in 2025.
Joe, thank you so much for your time this morning and spending your day after Christmas with us. Joe Bruce-Wallace of RSM. Let's get you an update on other stories you need to be watching out for this morning. Here's your Bloomberg Brief with Yahira Hackes. Hey, Yahira.
Hi, Anne-Marie. Russia launched a large-scale missile attack on Ukraine's energy infrastructure yesterday. The assault prompted the local power grid operator to limit supplies, leaving 500,000 people without heat amid the bitter cold. The attack included 70 missiles and more than 100 attack drones, according to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. U.S. President Joe Biden called Russia's Christmas Day attack outrageous and vowed continued U.S. weapons deliveries. Meanwhile, the U.S. will bring back family detention centers when President-elect Donald Trump returns to the office. That's according to the incoming White House border czar, Tom Homan. In an interview with the Washington Post, Homan said U.S. immigration authorities will look to put families with children in soft-sided tents and will not hesitate to deport parents who are in the country illegally. And the Baltimore Ravens with a decisive road win over the Houston Texans in the second NFL game on Christmas Day. Houston was no match for Baltimore's running game, with Derrick Henry topping 140 yards on the ground and scoring a touchdown. Reigning league MVP Lamar Jackson added 87 rushing yards and a touchdown of his own and became the NFL's all-time leading rushing quarterback, topping the previous record holder, Michael Vick. Baltimore now moves closer to locking down the division title after Pittsburgh's loss to Kansas City. That's your Bloomberg Brief. Anne-Marie?
Thanks so much, Yahira. Coming up on the program, Redfin's Chen Zhao joins us with her 2025 outlook for the housing market. That's coming up next right here on Bloomberg Surveillance.
Do you think it'll be the case where someday you will be an investment committee or I'll be an investment committee and we just apply AI, decide whether it's a good deal or not, or we're not going to be there anytime soon?
I don't think we'll be there in the near term. And David, because being on investment committees, there's the analytics of the math, there's the people, and then there's judgment. So analytics and math, I think AI will help us get way more refined. Right now, we have analysts building models upon models. Our typical investment memo is 86 pages. So we could refine that down very, very seamlessly to pieces. The people aspect to it, to make a judgment call on, do I believe this entrepreneur is going to go the next mile? Do I believe that the background of the entrepreneur, who they are, what they stand for, their values, their family, that's the harder one. I think AI is going to take some time to get there. And then the final piece ends up being judgment. And I don't believe we've seen anything yet that gives us a sense of judgment that we're able to apply.
From our studios in New York and San Francisco, our expert hosts have the data and analysis about the companies you know and the startups to watch, plus the interviews you don't want to miss. Watch Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow on Bloomberg Technology, the only daily business show dedicated to tech, right in the middle of the trading action, every weekday, only on Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything.
There is this real momentum from Wall Street.
We are basically deep in the European earnings season.
Take a look at how we're faring when it comes to Asian markets.
It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ, Monday on Bloomberg.
Good morning and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance. We did get initial jobless claims come through, softer than what the market was expecting. Futures this morning are pulling back slightly. We are in the red. S&P 500 futures down nearly 0.4% this morning. Yields, though, that's where the action is this morning, climbing on the 10-year up more than 4 basis points, 4.62%. Turning now to the housing market. Chen Zhao of Redfin Economics noting the Fed's less dovish stance, warning, quote, this hawkish stance from the Fed will keep mortgage rates high until there is data showing a weaker economy and or the incoming administration dials back their plans for policy changes, especially on tariffs. Chen joins us now. Chen, when you look at the mortgage rates, they're basically the same from the January 2024 to December 2024. Is there any glimmer of hopes for those trying to buy a house in 2025?
Good morning. Thanks so much for having me. So you're absolutely right. Mortgage rates for really the last couple of years has, bounced around a lot, but they've generally stayed pretty high. And we're ending the year with pretty high mortgage rates. As we're looking into 2025, what we're expecting is that mortgage rates are probably going to be volatile, similar to what we've seen, but that they're probably also going to remain pretty high. We don't really see a lot of room for rates to fall. We heard from the Fed just very recently, and they're not expecting to cut their policy rate very much. And even if they do, there's already 1 to 2 cuts priced in, and long-term rates like mortgage rates are influenced by a lot of other factors beyond the Fed's policy.
What about actual house pricing? If you cannot get a deal when it comes to mortgage rates, is potentially there room for negotiation when it comes to the cost of housing?
So, inventory is still constrained, and that's what's really been keeping home prices high. So we expect that home prices will continue to rise in 2025, around the same rate that they're rising right now, which is about 4 to 5%. So we might get maybe a little bit of a slower home price increase into next year, and that might be because we get just a little bit more inventory. As time goes on, we do expect that more sellers, existing homeowners will become sellers as, life circumstances force them to really move. So with that, I think that is a little bit of a glimmer of hope for buyers in the sense that hopefully next year there's a little bit more selection as they are, looking around the housing market, even if prices continue to be high and mortgage rates are likely to be high as well.
Chen, Jay here. What are you looking for in terms of new home construction? Are you constructive on an increase in the number of new homes built next year?
We do think that that is possible. We think that in the short term, you might see a little bit of an increase, but also in the more medium to long run, if the new administration does bring about more deregulation and lowers the cost of constructing new homes, you could definitely see more home construction in the more longer term. However, that's going to take longer to play out in terms of kind of as an affordability relief for home buyers.
So one of the, and when we think of things big picture-wise, we look at construction and employment as kind of a leading indicator traditionally, right, to a weak labor market. It sounds like you're not expecting problems in the construction side in terms of employment.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of uncertainty right now, right, as we're rounding the bend into a new administration. So the labor market has certainly remained strong. However, the construction industry does also rely heavily on immigrant labor. So depending on how the new administration chooses to carry out its plans around immigration, I think that could certainly have an effect on the housing market.
You also think that 2025 will be a renter's market. Why is that? Is that because just owning a home becomes so elusive for so many people?
Yes, so I think we're starting to see that wedge in affordability between buying a home and renting is really increasing, and we expect that to continue in 2025. So after the pandemic, so during the pandemic, rents rose a lot, but home prices also rose a lot. But the difference is that after the pandemic in the last couple of years, we also had mortgage rates shoot up. So that's just brought the for sale market in terms of affordability to really kind of like these sort of off the charts numbers. And that's been a real challenge for home buyers, especially first time home buyers who have not benefited from equity gains on their existing properties. But on the rental side, what we've seen is that a lot of the, boom in multifamily construction, that has really paid dividends for renters in the sense that rents have stayed pretty flat for the last couple of years. In our Redfin data on the rental market, what we've seen is that right now rents are probably around the same level they were about 2 years ago. And we expect that to continue into 2025 as there is still more supply coming onto the market. So that is why we're saying 2025 could really be a renter's market.
Your prediction number 10 on your list is Gen Z will rewrite the American dream. What do you mean by that?
We mean that the American dream has, in general, historically always included buying your first home. However, as this wedge between the affordability in the housing market and the rental market continues to increase, what we think will happen is that for a lot of the younger generation, they will continue to rent for longer. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't build wealth. They can still continue to build wealth in other ways, but it just won't necessarily be through the housing market as much as for previous generations.
Chen, quick question on rates. Is there a mortgage rate level that you think really freezes the market?
Well, so what we're seeing right now at the end of 2024 is that mortgage rates are right around 7%, but we've seen a real pickup in activity. NAR just released their November existing home sales, and that increased above 4 million for the first time since the springtime. Our Redfin pending sales data is up about 4 to 5% year over year. We're also seeing increased demand for tours from our agents since the November election. So it does seem like the same pattern that we've seen between mortgage rates and housing market activity, it's changing a little bit now since we've had high rates for so long. However, I do think that, if rates go much higher above where they are right now, maybe if we get closer to 7.5%, that would really put a freeze on the housing market.
You talked about labor as being an issue with the incoming administration's immigration policy mix. Is there also a concern about tariffs on places like Canada in terms of timber and wood? I'm just curious. It's not my area of expertise, but do we import a lot of wood from Canada that could have a major tariff slapped on it?
Yes, I think that with the new incoming administration, there's kind of a bag of different policy ideas that they are just talking about. So there are some things that will definitely be a tailwind for the housing market in terms of, deregulating and kind of like lowering the costs for construction. However, you could potentially also see some headwinds, and those would come in the form of any restrictions on immigration, or as you point out, tariffs on that would increase the prices for building materials. So anything that really increases the cost for building housing, that would definitely put a damper on the housing market. And not having enough housing is really kind of the root cause of a lot of the problems that we have in the housing market.
Chen, just briefly, to wrap us up, what are the hottest 3 housing markets right now in the United States?
So, I mean, where we're really seeing the most activity right now is in a lot of more affordable markets. So those are going to be places that are in the Midwest or in the Northeast, where you still have a lot of demand and you have demographic tailwinds, but there hasn't been a lot of new construction, which is what you've seen in, for example, the Sun Belt, where you see a lot of cooler housing markets.
Chen, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Chen Zhao of Redfin Economics. Of course, a lot of people are looking for places where they can actually get on the housing market. If you look at these mortgage rates, they're basically the same coming into 2024 as they are leaving 2024. Jay Pulaski, thank you for joining us for the 60 Minutes. As we look ahead to 2025, what's your top piece of advice? What are you focused on?
Well, look, we've had a great year. We're getting ready for Q4 earnings. Earnings have been the support for equities, particularly in the U.S., also globally. We're really watching 4 indicators right now. So one is the China long bond, right? It's had a huge rally. We need that rally to reverse to show that the stimulus that China is putting into place is actually starting to bite, right? So we want rates going up in China. We want to see the commodity sector get back above its 200-day resistance, right? Commodities will suggest that the global growth picture that we think is pretty constructive is in fact correct. So we want to watch commodities. Then we want to watch emerging markets. We think emerging markets could be the place to be next year. And right now we look at China, as we talked about earlier, China outperforming the U.S., China leading EM. We want to see EM get above their technical levels. And the last thing, which we've touched on a couple of times throughout the hour, is the dollar, right? How does all this play out in the dollar? Right now, the dollar is kind of pressing up against important technical levels, which if it breaks through 109, that means it's going higher, and that's a problem for our mix on EM and non-U.S. markets.
So you're looking to see potentially 2024 being peak U.S. dollar?
Well, peak exceptionalism, right? U.S. is priced for exceptionalism. Are we going to be exceptional relative to the rest of the world going forward? We think that balance is going to tilt more towards the rest of the world.
It'll be a fascinating year. Jay, thank you so much for ending 2024 with me and for joining us this past hour. Coming up tomorrow, I'll be back in the studio. Marvin Lowe of State Street will be joining us alongside Dan Ives of Wedbush, Dan Greenhouse of Solus, and Anna Rathbun of CBiz. This was Bloomberg Surveillance as we set you up for the cash equity market open in just about 40 minutes time. You are seeing futures pull back today. Not exactly the Santa Claus rally that everyone was hoping for today. Still a few days left though for 2024. S&P 500 futures down 0.4%. This is Bloomberg.
It's the countdown to the market open as we bring you the first trades across Europe.
We'll debate the most important stories and what will drive the big investment decisions throughout the morning. I'm Guy Johnson.
I'm Kriti Gupta.
And I'm Anna Edwards. Join us every weekday morning for the opening trade, live at 7 a.m. here in London.
Only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Been offers before to take over Greyhound, but then in the midst of the pandemic 2.5 years ago, we had this fantastic opportunity to buy the brand and the network. When we took on Greyhound onto the Flix tech platform for network management, revenue management, we saw the highest unit economics in more than 100 years of Greyhound history.
My vision is to transform long-distance bus travel in the United States and make it one of the top considerations for anyone planning a long-haul journey.
CEO Kai Boyson imagines even more potential
if state and local governments recognize the need to support long-distance bus travel with integrated infrastructure.
We need to think about the infrastructure in the United States holistically and think about the transportation system as one integrated system. And intercity bus needs to be an integral part of that system. One should be able to connect from one mode of transport to another seamlessly, easily. We have great success models in the United States. For example, Los Angeles Union Station, Boston South Station, or New York Port Authority Bus Terminal, or Washington, D.C. Union Stations.
Kai and the team, they are doing a fantastic job. They have really improved the product, they have improved technology, they have really made the production more efficient, that at the moment it's also a profitably growing business.
The top names in business are on Bloomberg.
We are in the midst of the largest wealth transfer in history right at this very moment. So $100 trillion of wealth is going to next-gen and millennial clients over the next decade. So that has some pretty significant implications. But in addition to that, women are controlling more and more global wealth. Today, they control a third of global wealth, but in the next 5 years, $30 trillion is going to pass in the hands of women, and they're going to control over 50% of the global wealth market out there today. Women care deeply about investing with purpose, investing to make an impact, doing good with their investment. So you're going to see some significant opportunities for us as we lean in and have been leaning in to capturing more of the female wallet globally.
Nobody covers business like Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Jumpstart your trading day on Bloomberg Open Interest.
2 hours of single stock stories that are driving the opening bell action. We'll take you to Wall Street, Main Street, the C-suite, and beyond.
These are companies that are growing their market.
The great companies in the U.S. are the companies hitting the cutting edge. That's a different story.
Get the inside track on what's buzzing in markets.
With the players who are shaping the narrative.
If you have bad earnings reports, you're going to get punished.
They're not buying what the industry is selling. Join us on Bloomberg Open Interest. Weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern, only on Bloomberg.
Bloomberg loves earnings.
I know it's like your Super Bowl, right?
I can't wait. It's like opening presents in the morning.
All right, it will be exciting.
Nobody covers earnings like Bloomberg.
All right. Good Thursday morning. Paul Sweeney, David Gura. We're in New York City. We're doing the TV radio simulcasting.
People are here in the studio with us.
People are in the studio. We're working hard for you. A lot going on here in the marketplace here today. Just looking at the markets, David, there's not a lot going on today. I think a little bit of a weakness on the screen, but we're going to bring it for the next 3 hours. I'm Paul Sweeney, David Gura. Special edition of Bloomberg Markets, Bloomberg Television and Radio. Futures here looking a little bit weak here. The S&P off about 22 points, the Dow off 165, NASDAQ off 81 points. We're going to talk about these markets. We're going to talk about some economic data. We're going to talk about the 2025 outlook for a lot of smart people are thinking about it. I mean, think about it. In 2023, 2024, you had more than 20% return in the equity markets. What do you do to top that in 2025? So we're going to have all that coming up. Right now, let's get a look at how the markets are moving. Alex Semenova joins us. She covers all the equity markets for Bloomberg News. She joins us here in our radio studio. Alex, what are you looking at?
Great to be on with you guys. So, Paul, as you mentioned, a pretty quiet day in the equity market, but there are still some individual companies on the move. The first one I'm taking a look at is Alibaba. The company agreed to merge its South Korean operations with eMart Inc.'s e-commerce platform. This is intended to help the company better compete in the country's fast-growing online retail sector. The deal is creating a 50-50 joint venture. This is according to a stock exchange filing by eMart, which confirmed a Bloomberg News report. Our colleagues were the first to break this news. The companies plan to make further investments in the JV. People familiar with the deal say that the new entity could be valued at $4 billion. Not much of a move, though, on Alibaba right now. Let's call shares flat in pre-market trading. Alibaba's Hong Kong listed stock gained about 11% this year, valuing the firm at more than $200 billion.
What else you got for us?
Also taking a look at stocks with exposure to cryptocurrencies. They're falling today. This is, of course, amid a retreat in Bitcoin after it had a pretty torrid run since Donald Trump's election back in November. Names like MicroStrategy and Riot Platforms are down this morning. The declines come even as MicroStrategy said that it is seeking to increase authorized shares to provide more firepower to purchase Bitcoin, not helping the cryptocurrency much, though. It already bought $561 million worth of the digital token, and the company has seen its shares under pressure recently. It, of course, bought Bitcoin at an all-time high last week before the token retreated. So, of course, its underlying value is tied to how Bitcoin moves.
Bearing in mind it is a relatively quiet day here on Wall Street, any winners and losers that you pick out in terms of sectors here on trade today?
Just taking a look at what happened this year, the scoreboard is pretty incredible. If you look at the S&P 500, all but one of 11 sectors are in the green. Some of the winners, unsurprising, are the sectors that hold the Magnificent Seven stocks. That's communication services, information technology, consumer discretionary. In communication services, Netflix and Meta Platforms are winners, up more than 90% and 70% on the year, respectively. In information technology, we have names like NVIDIA, Broadcom, of course, the AI darlings that have led this market higher for much of the last year and a half. And consumer discretionary, surprisingly, the big winner is Deckers Outdoor, and then after that, Tesla, which of course has been recovering since Donald Trump's election with Elon Musk in the White House. Then we also have financials benefiting from expectations for deregulation, increased M&A activity and IPOs, and utilities, of course, also a winner of this AI euphoria with data center usage and the perception also of utilities as a defensive sector.
Alex Simonova, thank you very much for that market update. We'll go to you throughout the morning here. And I want to kind of focus, still stick with consumer discretionary, which you mentioned a moment ago, the consumer sector. Joining us now is Martin Dolphy, founder and managing partner of Belliata, private equity firm investing in consumer companies, including Van Leeuwen Ice Cream and Kosas, a clean beauty brand. He's with us in our studio in New York City. And Martin, let me just ask you, first of all, just about the environment that we're looking at going into 2025. There was so much enthusiasm and optimism in those days after the election about how the environment was going to change in terms of deal making. And I'm curious, from your vantage, what that looks like, what notionally you think is going to be different here in the new year.
I think, thanks for having me, everybody. Happy holidays. I think 2025 is just going to be an acceleration of what we started to see happening in 2024. In our portfolios, we saw a big uptick in strategics and sponsors, kind of, talking to our companies about acquisitions. I think the IPO market in the consumer sector was up 40% in 2024. So, we're very optimistic that this, it's going to be a flurry of activity in 2025 in the consumer sector. Driven by almost $2.1 billion in dry powder from private equity sponsors that are motivated to deploy that capital. And we're excited and very optimistic about next year.
Private equity, lots of cash on that particular asset class. I need to lever it up, though. Are the banks there to get deals done? Where do you get the debt capital to leverage up your equity?
Well, we have a couple companies that are in process right now working with top investment banks, and part of their pitch to us to engage them to sell these companies were to kind of do a leverage analysis and see how they could kind of, get a lower cost of capital to leverage up these assets for acquisition. So we're confident it's there, and we're happy to see that the cost of capital is coming down a little bit to support those acquisitions.
You mentioned a couple of companies in your portfolio. When you look at them, what do they tell us? What can they tell us about just sort of what companies are doing well, which have good prospects at this point in time? The sort of success that you've seen there, how does that transfer to or translate to other companies?
Well, we're really focused on the American family, I think, and just making them healthier. So, if we're investing in an apparel brand, it's a fitness brand. Rhone was my first investment back in 2015. They've obviously grown and, just did a really landmark partnership with the NBA. So anything that encourages outdoor activity and fitness, Cotopaxi, Poncho Outdoors down in Texas that has this great fly fishing outdoor brand. So just, active outdoor, and I think when you move into the like food area, I think it's better for you food. We got to pay attention to what, you know, as parents, I have 3 young kids, what we're feeding our children, and I think just, you know, making smarter decisions around food and the healthy family. And then I think, you know, we also invest across beauty and retail. You know, beauty is about like, you know, cleaner labels, less toxic ingredients. We all know this stuff is absorbed into our skin and has ramifications. So I think, you know, thinking about that and just new retail. I mean, these brands that we work with have brick and mortar retail, but they also have e-commerce and wholesale. And I think just like this omni-channel, you know, in retail, you know, around consumer brands and families is going to be very important next year.
Martin's saying that Van Leeuwen is a healthy investment.
Is it?
I will tell my children that.
Nice.
Pester me. Great attitude.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Well, Alex Steele always tells me, you got to invest in your face. John Tucker and I, we missed that memo years ago, but Alex is on top of it. How important is Made in America?
I think it's huge. You know, we kind of did this audit of our portfolio, you know, over the last few years, and also an audit of our household. There's so much stuff that's made in China, you know, and you know, as parents, we all know this stuff that these toys that come over, you know, they end up in the kid's mouth and they're gnawing on them, and you know, the stuff in the microplastics. And so I think you know, with this new administration coming in and putting a real emphasis on like Made in America, I think is huge, and we're putting a big emphasis on investing in brands that are you know, we just invested in a new business up in Boston called Stone and Skillet that makes a great English muffin. It's a, you know, generational story with family, and they kind of make their own English muffins up there. Van Leeuwen's obviously making their own ice cream in Brooklyn. We're invested in an organic hummus brand called Little Sesame that the sources from Montana. I mean, these are the stories that the consumers want. I mean, they want, you know, authenticity. They want a trusted relationship with the brand. They want, you know, they want that. And I think for the longevity of the, you know, the U.S. economy, I think we have to start manufacturing more in the United States. And so we're definitely putting a big emphasis on that.
I'm, of course, a New York partisan. I love living here. If I'm not mistaken, you have an office in Nashville, Tennessee.
Yeah.
And I'm curious just sort of how that differentiates what you're able to do, sort of being there versus here in New York, and as you look at sort of the industry as a whole, I imagine that's, as you see, an advantage not to be based here entirely and to have kind of a big footprint there as well.
Yeah, well, I'm from Tennessee, and my partner Whitney Williams down in Nashville is also from Tennessee. So I think, you know, down in the Southeast, there's really nothing that looks like us. You know, there's not really a private equity venture firm investing in consumer brands. I think part of what a friend of mine, Steve Case at Revolution, you know, kind of, you know, instilled in me early on was like this rise of the rest effort, right? And you know, valuations on deals can be more interesting in those middle America markets. The entrepreneurs can be just as savvy and exciting to back. So we're looking all over the place in terms of, you know, finding companies based in really like all 50 states. We've got companies in Utah and Texas and Tennessee and Colorado, and you know, those are great, of course. And I think a part of that is any brand we get involved with has to be able to sell to middle America. You know, while Van Leeuwen might be here in New York City or Rhone in Connecticut, like these are brands that have got to be able to sell into Nordstrom and Dillard's and all, you know, kind of this aspirational tier that can become large. So it's a top priority for us to be looking for brands in middle America.
It seems to be, since the election, it just feels to me that in this country, from an economic perspective, there's this sense of optimism. I mean, do you sense that out there with your companies that you talk to, with the investors that you talk to? It feels just maybe from a regulatory perspective, a tax perspective, I'm not sure what, but at least from an economic perspective, broadly defined, it feels like a sense of optimism out there.
Yeah, we feel it. I mean, we've seen broad-based gains across our portfolios in 23, 24, and I think it's starting to accelerate. We've got great initial data from Rhone and some of our brands on how big the holiday season's been. I think this like easing of regulation, also with like the tax changes that are coming down, and also how kind of tariffs may help, you know, kind of level the playing field a bit for these like brands here, I think is, and of course the public markets and how they performed. It just, I think, really given, you know, our companies and our team a lot of optimism heading into the new year.
We've got about a minute left. I'm just curious sort of what you're going to be watching for. We've talked a lot about policy uncertainty in recent days on this show. Sort of what are you going to be watching for an indication of sort of where things are headed in terms of, you know, what the next administration brings, what they do versus what they maybe had as kind of campaign bombast and rhetoric?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that is probably posturing to negotiate, and these things are going to settle out in Q1, Q2. We're paying very close attention how our brands are reorienting their supply chain. A lot of our brands have moved, over the last 3 or 4 years, kind of diversified away from China into Sri Lanka and India and Vietnam. But we want to bring a lot of that, back to the United States, and we're keeping a close eye on it. A lot of our, companies' boards of directors are as well. And we believe the U.S. consumer is strong. Still remains strong.
Still spending.
Yeah. I mean, definitely. I think for these kind of health-oriented brands, family-oriented brands, absolutely.
All right, Martin, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Martin Dolphy, he is Belliad founder and managing partner, joining us live here in our Bloomberg studio. Appreciate getting his thoughts here on the consumer. And again, I think when you hear, we had Paul Taubman recently from PJT, one of the leading M&A bankers out there, just in the last couple weeks, saying he expects 2025 to be a big year in terms of economic activity and deal activity. And they're actually hiring bankers this year to get ready for next year.
Translating that enthusiasm into heads at that firm, and I think that excitement, that enthusiasm does seem to be real from the folks I've been talking to as well, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll see. So I think the expectation is for a good M&A environment in 2025, good IPO environment for in 2025, in part due to maybe rates coming down a little bit. Although we've seen the Treasury market trade yields go higher despite the Fed cutting rates. So we'll see how that plays out. Quick check of the market here: S&P 500 off 20 points, Dow off 157, the NASDAQ off 73 points. All of that is about a third of 1%. 10-year Treasury yields a little bit higher here, 4.63% on your Treasury market. It was a tough year for European luxury in 2024, but there's some optimism for a rebound as we head into the new year. We're going to explain all that coming up next as we think about putting a little bow on 2024 and thinking about 2025. David Gura and I, we are here in New York helping you guys close out the year and get ready for next year. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
From the beating heart of global finance, economics, and politics, and wherever newsmakers are moving markets, Bloomberg brings you conversations that allow for deep discussions and important insights. What do you think the future is for inflation? Is this a new normal? Are markets too optimistic? How do you worry about the things that are outside your control? How does the current fighting completely stop? I'm Francine Lacqua, and this is The Pulse, every weekday only on Bloomberg.
We felt strongly that there has been an opportunity for there to be an experience on mobile that is centered around gamers. Like, we talk a lot about how there's 3 billion gamers in the world. 2 of those billion play on mobile, and half of those actually play on mobile and they play on another device. But there isn't actually a gaming platform and store experience that is centered around players and goes truly across device, where who you are, your library, your identity, your rewards, that travels with you versus being locked to a single ecosystem. And we've recognized that opportunity for a long time, but we wanted to make sure that anything we built was really grounded in people who play those mobile native games and the creators of them. And so being joined with a team that has real deep expertise in mobile was important to us.
It's the world's second largest economy with a growing influence in global affairs. But geopolitical uncertainties, deflationary pressures, and questions about foreign investment linger. Bloomberg, the China Show, brings you the unmatched expertise you need to keep track of breaking news, in-depth market analysis, and the most influential newsmakers in and around China. Bloomberg, the China Show, weeknights at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
I'm David Gura in New York with Paul Sweeney. This is a special edition of Bloomberg Markets on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. The CEO of luxury jeweler Bulgari is positive about the company's growth in 2024, despite a slowdown of the Chinese consumer. He spoke exclusively to Bloomberg in Shanghai.
When you have a crisis which is based partially on real estate, but more, I would say, exactly on oversupply, not only of real estate, but of many manufactured goods, which are too many to be absorbed not only by the local Chinese living in China, but also internationally by Western consumers or Asian consumers. Obviously, this cannot be resolved overnight because oversupply is also related to a certain infrastructure, to certain kind of investments which have to be reshifted towards different industries, probably more services and a bit less of traditional industry production. So we can anticipate that the crisis in China may continue next year, as the country will need, I think, a couple of years at least to absorb that oversupply of manufactured goods and real estate, and to evolve quickly towards an economy which is more a service-oriented economy, rather than an economy also much more in some advanced technologies, which they are already, but they can do for sure more, in order, I mean, to reestablish a balance between supply and demand, which today is challenging.
Jean-Christophe, are you then looking at opening more stores in mainland China in 2025, 2026? What's your expansion plan?
In Greater China, generally speaking, we have about 50 stores, so I would say it's quite a solid network covering the main cities, the main malls in a rather good location, I have to say. So our first priority for this year and for next year is not necessarily, I mean, to open new stores, because I think that our network is so covering quite well mainland China. But to get more productivity from those stores on the one hand, and on the other hand, to further develop an area where we've been pioneering the market, that is e-commerce, not only the e-commerce we do from our website, but the e-commerce we do in concession with the likes of Tmall, with the likes of JD, and this is obviously reaching cities where we don't have stores and where we don't necessarily need to establish stores because they are not having the proper mall for luxury. On the other hand, they have the proper clients for luxury. And so, obviously, e-commerce is a smart way to reach those clients, to make them enjoy the Bulgari experience without necessarily having a boutique in each and every city of China above 5 million people.
That was the CEO of Bulgarian Conversation with Islina in Shanghai. And let's get a closer look now at the luxury sector. We're joined by Bloomberg's Natalia Knijovic. She's here with us in our studio in New York. Let's, before we look ahead, look back at what this year brought. We were talking there, hearing them talk a bit about sort of the appetite for retail at the luxury level in China in particular. What stood out to you as you look back on 2024 when it comes to demand for luxury goods in the retail sector?
Right. So it's been a very challenging year for sure for luxury goods, for European luxury companies more specifically. The main source of pain, of course, was weak demand in China. China, as we know, accounts for about 15% of global luxury market. Then China announced massive stimulus. It was a big driver for that sector. For example, Goldman Sachs Group has a basket that tracks this sector. It's up now by 8%. But nevertheless, we see some notable decliners. For example, LVMH, this is basically a barometer of luxury segment. It's down by 14%. Then Kering, which owns Gucci, it's down by 40%. And in contrast, companies that serve the wealthiest clients, such as Hermes, they are up. So, for example, Hermes is up by 20%. For us, it's just a signal that wealthiest customers will keep spending. Companies can still have ability to increase prices, put on those price costs on consumers, and it can keep going. But again, it all depends on Chinese demand. And I would like to highlight one American brand. Go. Ralph Lauren, guys, the stock is up by 60%. Wow. And nice. Again, it's also a signal that American consumers keep spending. The company also does really good job in terms of marketing, promotion, working with celebrities, and attracting young customers. And we see that analysts and investors really, really like the stock.
Yeah, when you look at Ralph Lauren, I'm just kind of, looking at it. I mean, it's been such a solid performer here. what is the expectation for just luxury spending in 2025?
Right. So again, it all depends on consumers' strength. Here in the United States, we always talk about China, right? It all depends on stimulus and how Chinese customers will be willing or not willing to spend, travel to Europe. We know that they buy lots of luxury goods in Europe and here in the U.S. as well. But also, we are keeping an eye on the United States. First, the Federal Reserve is lowering interest rates, and now Donald Trump announced tax cut. It can be potentially a driver for that sector, stronger dollar as well. But overall, analysts are really cautious. They say you cannot buy all luxury stocks now. You have to be very selective. And as I mentioned, few companies, they perform so in such a different way. So yes, probably it will be a stock picker market for in 2024-5.
Natalia, you mentioned sort of the way the tax policy might shape consumer habits here going into 2025. I can't help but think about the tariffs policies, trade policies more broadly that the president-elect has talked about. And of course, we're talking about many companies that aren't headquartered here in the U.S. If it's LVMH, it's in Paris, for instance. But when you look at the broader global landscape in terms of consumer goods and economics, how much is the potential for changes to trade policy likely to change the appetite for the ability to get the luxury goods that we've been talking about?
Absolutely. And I think companies will be really, really very cautious when it comes to global expansion. So, for example, Ralph Lauren, it doesn't have such a huge presence in China, but the company is trying to expand. Now, when tariffs come to play, they will be maybe more concerned about how much they can allocate in terms of resources, sales, production in China. It will be a big driver for the market as well. And again, it all comes down to supply chains, number one, but also consumers' ability to spend as well, as prices will keep moving higher. And even some luxury customers, we see that they are not willing to buy some goods, and they are trying to think about the value of those luxury goods, if it's worth to pay $2,000 for a pair of shoes.
You know, I'm going to walk to Penn Station like I do every day after I finally get off the air at noon, and I'll see I'll see European broadly defined tourists, Fifth Avenue, Madison Avenue. They're there in force. I don't see the Chinese consumer back as much as we used to see pre-pandemic. Is there an expectation that might change at any time in the near future?
Maybe not the near future. Again, it depends on how quickly China will move with the stimulus and how willing, again, Chinese customers will be to travel. You're absolutely right. Usually we see so many Chinese customers in Europe and in the United States during holidays. I haven't been in that area lately, but I will have to
check it out.
Paul's anecdotal reporting.
Anecdotal reporting.
Fifth Avenue.
Madison Avenue, Fifth Avenue. You walk down to Penn Station, and the sidewalks are packed with tourists. It is total pre-pandemic traffic, it seems like, and every language under the sun is being spoken there. So it feels like, you know, that kind of that tourist-driven
in the zeitgeist.
In the zeitgeist, as someone is wont to say. But again, you just haven't seen a lot of the Chinese consumers come back. And I know from your reporting and others that they are so critical to luxury spending. Natalia, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate getting your thoughts. Natalia Kiniajevich, she covers all the stock market for Bloomberg News. We appreciate getting some of her reporting here. Again, futures a little bit lower here on the day. Coming up, we're going to check in with Ancora portfolio manager David Sowerby. He's going to join us here as we try to get these markets open for you in just a few moments, get his thoughts on his 2024 performance and then maybe where he sees 2025 coming up, where the opportunities in the marketplace. Again, S&P futures minus 20, Dow minus 160, NASDAQ down 70. The European markets are not trading. It's this Boxing Day thing. I think we should do that here in the U.S. I'm going to call somebody. This is Bloomberg.
Our investigation found some of the worst cases of harm were surfacing.
मुझे क्या पता कि भला के चक्कर में मेरा ही बुरा हो जाएगा।
I never thought I would be vulnerable to a scam. This ruined me, and I didn't have any real good explanation for it.
Wildlife trafficking is almost always driven by greed.
Once you start focusing on money, you lose sight of what is best. That's where things go wrong.
Asia is at the forefront of some of the world's biggest stories. I'm Sherian in Tokyo.
And I'm Heidi Stroud-Watts here in Sydney, where the trading day begins. We're here in the center of all the action to get you set up with the numbers, news, and knowledge you need for the day ahead.
The demand is indeed recovering. We've been waiting for this moment.
The opportunity of a century.
Join us on Bloomberg The Asia Trade. Weekdays only on Bloomberg TV. Context changes everything.
AI, how it has penetrated pretty much all sectors, including music. AI can write music, compose music. How do you see AI changing the landscape in fashion?
Yeah, AI definitely helped. When I did the jewelry, I used the AI, helping me to give some idea, but ultimately you still have to do a lot with it. They just give you very superficial ideas, but at the end, you still have to customize and have to really make it and do that. I do not think that AI and the technology can replace the human mind at this moment.
Are you concerned one day we won't be able to differentiate designs by AI and designs by an actual designer?
I don't know. For me, I feel that, when a designer is doing, it's the spirit, it's the heart that the computer don't have.
As we spend some time here on the broader presidential race.
Let's focus in on European politics.
Makes you wonder how politics might play out.
Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
Massive outperformance from Bitcoin.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people.
The tectonic shift emanating from Washington.
All we're looking for is clear rules and an ability to build in the United States.
Crypto shouldn't be partisan.
The transactions.
Really a record-breaking moment.
Crypto VC is back.
And the technology.
It's really the beginning of a global on-chain economy.
And if America doesn't embrace it, we're going to be left behind.
Bloomberg Crypto, Tuesdays, only on Bloomberg. Bloomberg covers the world with unmatched reach and resources. From more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, context changes everything.
All right, we are moments away from the start of trading here this morning on this Thursday, the day after Christmas. They call it Boxing Day over there in the UK. I'm Paul Sweeney, along with David Gurr. We're here in New York City. This is a special edition of Bloomberg Markets on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Interesting to see how we kind of close out the year. Again, you're going to get 24, 25% return in the S&P 500. That's darn solid. I mean, I can't imagine anybody complaining here.
Struck by those we've talked to this morning have said, maybe not expect gains of that size going forward, but still very optimistic about equities in particular in the year ahead.
Yeah, and then if you look at the S&P equal weighted, only about 14 or 15% return year to date. So, if you weren't in some of those, only. Yeah, exactly. I should be only. But if you weren't in some of those, big cap tech names, maybe you missed out a little bit. So let's take a look at some of the stocks that are moving under the surface. Bloomberg's Alex Semenova. Let's start with Apple. Alex, what are you looking at there?
Yeah, so it got a price target upgrade this morning, unsurprisingly from Wedbush, being raised to a street high of $325 from $300. Dan Ives, who is obviously somewhat of a permabull on Apple, writes that the company is heading into a multi-year AI-driven iPhone upgrade cycle. This upgrade cycle, he says, is still being underestimated by Wall Street. The firm sees a growth catalyst from a new multi-billion annual services revenue stream. This is due to its apps built around AI technology, and it expects upgrades across the board for the next 12 to 18 months. It has an outperform rating, of course, on the stock. A very small move higher this morning, up about 0.4%. It is up more than 30% this year, of course, outperforming the S&P 500.
It's good from Apple to Progressive.
Yeah.
Another stock I know you're watching this morning.
Yeah, also a name that is getting an upgrade on the street to outperform from market performance Raymond James. The firm says that its long-term record of growth and value creation makes it a core holding for large cap growth investors. I was looking at the move year to date, up 53% year to date, guys. Pretty incredible move for Progressive.
How about on the crypto space here? I'm looking at Bitcoin, calling that out for Tom King, because I know he wants his quotes as he's sitting there at the cafe in Paris. 95,000 on the crypto, down about 3% here today.
Yeah, of course, we've been watching those stocks closely. Down this morning as Bitcoin retreats. Names like MicroStrategy and Riot Platforms, these names that are closely tied, of course, to the moves in cryptocurrencies. And the declines come even as MicroStrategy is seeking to increase authorized shares to purchase more Bitcoin. It, of course, already bought $561 million worth of the digital token. The stock has seen a bit of a retreat recently because it did buy Bitcoin at an all-time high before it pulled back a little bit. So those names under pressure this morning.
Interesting just to look at the role that MicroStrategy continues to play as kind of this catalytic force in the world of Bitcoin. Alex Simonova, thank you very much for that update. She'll be here throughout the morning. Joining us now is David Sowerby, and Core Portfolio Manager, here with us on this Boxing Day. I guess not in the U.S., but around the world. Save for you. You're celebrating, I know. But we're supposed to celebrate with the day off.
Canada, too.
Canada as well.
Yes.
Well said. The Commonwealth Ball.
My neighbor to the south.
Yes. Right. David, great to speak with you. And I want to start just by, before we look ahead, looking back on this last year, what lessons will you carry over from the way the market performed this year? And if you kind of think of this as chapters, how much is the story the same here going into 2025 for you?
Enough of the same, but one very good same is never underestimate the ability of solid U.S. companies to deliver superior capital allocation, shareholder value creation in the face of higher interest rates, questionable fiscal policy. Time and time again, bet on U.S. companies. That's been the rule of thumb for 30 plus years.
David, I mean, am I going to be lazy in 2025 and just hang on to my Mag 7, or should I take a little bit of roll up my sleeves a little bit, maybe take a look at some small caps, some mid caps, maybe some sectors or factors that haven't really performed over the past 2 years?
Well, Paul, I don't root against the Mag 7, but I think you have to think broader, more participation in the markets. We saw this rotation since July 11th, where small caps outperformed quite well, value outperformed growth, the Mag 7 lagged, and here we go into December. Mag 7 right back on the treadmill. Small caps have still modestly beat large caps since July 11th, 10% for small caps up, 7% for the S&P 500. It's that two steps forward, one step back in December, but I think we're back to small caps having very good returns in 2025 relative to some of the mega caps.
David, count me among those who hears that watchword or those watchwords, small caps, and just sort of wonders what to do with it. Where are you looking? When we talk about small caps, where is there opportunities you see it? What's your counsel to your clients about what sectors, what types of companies are of interest in that world?
A proven process for 20 plus years. Two buckets to look into. First, spin-offs. Small company spins out of a larger company, unlocks shareholder value. Look at the Bloomberg spin-off index in 2024. It's up better than 60%. That's the first bucket. The second bucket is under-followed companies where there's only two or fewer Wall Street analysts following the company compared to the previous story on Apple. So an example is National CineMedia, ticker symbol NCMI. Only two analysts follow the company. They do that advertising when you go to the movies.
Hate it.
And you get there early and you see that captive audience for advertising at National CineMedia, over 1,000 theaters they're in. There's an idea for an underfollowed small cap stock.
And that stock's just ripped. It's up 60% year to date with a market cap of about just $625 million. So that thing has worked here. David, how do you think about valuation here? Because I've got a Fed that I think maybe they're going to cut a couple of times in 2025, but I think that's it. It feels like earnings have to be a real driver of this market going forward. How do you feel about earnings vis-a-vis valuation these days?
All valuation rich. No other way to describe it. If you go on a free cash flow basis and value the market that way, not as rich, still opportunities for the investor. But you nailed it. It's a tug of war in 2025. Earnings, free cash flow, dividends will all be up 10% or better. That's pulling on the upside. but valuation is stretched. And I looked back to 1990. There have been 9 years in a calendar year where valuation went lower. And in those 9 years, the market only finished positive 4 out of 9 years when valuation slipped a bit. So that's the tug of war for 2025. Rich valuations, I hope they don't go lower, with earnings and free cash flow up double digits.
I could detect in what my friend Paul Sweeney was saying some disdain or eagerness to stop talking about the Federal Reserve as much as we have been over the course of this last year. What's the role that it's going to play in 2025 as you see it? I know you were listening closely to that press conference just a couple of days ago. How much is it going to be continuing to drive things going forward here as you look at valuations, as Paul suggests, other facets of investing beyond what the oracles down in the Eccles building are telling the market?
Well, you're in New York, so let's borrow from a famous New York investor, Reggie Jackson. The Fed is the straw that stirs the drink. So if the market only gets 2 interest rate cuts next year, I don't think the Fed should do any more. Their number one mission should always be price stability. And if the market doesn't like it in the near term, you have to grind through it. But at the same time, if inflation is not brought even a bit lower, just look at what the market did from 1965 to 1981. It was flat on an inflation-adjusted basis. It dropped 40 to 50%. So we have to be encouraging that the Fed stays committed to inflation. And that's going to be a story in 2025 in that tug of war relative to the, I think, favorable earnings, free cash flow, and free cash flow margins that'll still exist.
David, I've been doing this Wall Street thing since 1986. One of the really interesting markets to watch develop has been private credit. Talk to us about Ares Management Corporation.
Ares is one of the largest private credit publicly traded companies, so bank loans in particular. And that has been an insatiable appetite for pension funds. I sit on the City of Detroit's investment committee, my alma mater, Wayne State. I chair the State of Michigan Pension Fund for a number of years. The demand for private credit continues to grow because the expectations are you can get near like public equity returns without the same volatility. And that plays into a name like Ares, which is one of the largest private credit publicly traded companies.
You know, let's take advantage of the fact that you're there in Michigan. I'd love to get your sense of sort of not the politics of the election per se, but what issues were front and center, particularly in your home state, and what that tells you about what to focus on here in the years to come.
The economy, first and foremost. That cumulative inflation was up better than 20% since early 2020, 21. And I think that's why Michigan, perennial swing state, swung back for incoming President Trump relative to 2020, 2016. We end up voting with our pocketbook. The other factors matter, but I think that was the key reason for Michigan going back to Trump the way they did in 2016.
David, when you and your team woke up the day after Election Day, did you change your investment outlook for 2025 at all?
Generally, no, because I can't predict politics, Paul. My axiom in predicting politics is never expect Washington to do the right thing. They do the least amount to fix a problem. That said, after the election, you saw small cap stocks the day after pop 3 to 4%. That was validation that animal spirits were going to be resurrected, and we saw that November NFIB optimism index take a decided spike higher. That can be a factor that bodes well for the market next year, and in particular, animal spirits and small cap cyclically sensitive stocks.
You can't predict politics. Let me just ask you about geopolitics in terms of what you're watching and how that maybe colors your appetite for, say, assets outside the United States, equities overseas, other opportunities. Are you staying pretty closely focused on the U.S., or do you see opportunity across the Atlantic?
Outside the U.S., it's interesting, but the bias is still in U.S. domestic portfolios. And since the end of 1987, U.S. stocks have compounded five percentage points better compound annualized return, superior than the MSCI EFA. That goes back to the superiority of U.S. companies delivering shareholder value. The bar is high to have meaningful assets out of the U.S. You get enough diversification here, given our indexes.
So, David, what's your message to your clients? Do you have a thematic message to your clients for 2025?
I'm generally not that creative. Other than, keep your head down, find good companies that are generating capital and free cash flow to the investor. And at the end of the day, I'll have the same 5 risks that every Wall Street analyst has on the street. But ultimately, it's always going to be the risk you don't know that bites you the hardest.
Mm-hmm. David, do you still have clients who are on the more conservative side of things, who are part of that $6 trillion cash pile, who are reluctant to get back into this market? And if you do, what's the counsel you're giving them to jump in?
Generally, no. But if there are some, you just want to take a look at the potential for the S&P 500 or the average stock in the S&P 500 to compound 7 to 8% over the next 3 years. You're not going to get that in Treasury bills or Treasury notes. And the probability is probably better than 80% that the U.S. and the S&P 500, the average stock, will compound better than cash. I like those odds. The next calendar year, flip a coin. But the next 2 or 3 years, you feel like equities will still meaningfully outperform cash.
All right, David, thank you so much. We always appreciate getting a few minutes of your time. David Sowerby, and core portfolio manager from the great Midwest, out there giving us some views. And that's kind of what we need to get off this rock every once in a while, dude.
As we can. Although it's very cold there.
Yes, we can. Exactly. Exactly. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But the market's just a little bit of a sell-off here on this December 26th, the day after Christmas, Boxing Day, for our good friends in the greater UK. Coming up, we're going to get a little bit smart here as we talk to James Seifert. He's at Bloomberg Intelligence. He does the ETFs. That's another crazy growth story.
Eric Balchunas, his right-hand man.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, they're interchangeable, and they've got everything you need to know about the ETF space, but they're in a business that just goes up and to the right.
Yes,
I could sound smart on ETFs if you needed me to. But James Seifert from Bloomberg Intelligence, he's the ETF analyst. He's going to join us coming up in the next block. This is Bloomberg.
European countries need to think, do you want to compete as a small country or do you want to compete as Europe? I don't think they have a choice because the US and China have already started the race. And Europe needs to follow. There isn't a European company in the top 20 largest firms in the world. That is a problem.
But what does it mean for individual countries within Europe?
You can have more control and less growth, or you can have less control and more growth. If countries trust each other more and they build more European champions rather than each country having its own national champion, growth is going to be better, productivity growth is going to be better, the welfare is going to be better. But there is going to be less control at the national level. So right now, each European country wants to have its own telecom company, its own couple of large banks,
its own bank,
its own large energy companies. And the question is, are you willing to surrender some of this control to European firms, which are going to be more productive, but you are going to have less control at the national level?
In case you missed it, on Bloomberg Open Interest.
We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear what you think about our shows here on Bloomberg Television. Do you think we're doing well? Do you think we need to change some things?
Do you like Matt Miller?
Should I wear a wig on a regular basis?
Please write that in. I'm scared.
The first monthly loss for the S&P in 7 months, 30 minutes until it started trading. I'm Matt Miller.
I'm Sonali Basak.
And I'm Katie Greifeld. Don't miss Open Interest live weekdays.
Names that move markets are on Bloomberg.
Our budget proposes an additional $3 trillion of deficit reduction over 10 years. And I think that's necessary to make sure that our fiscal path is sustainable. Now, Congress hasn't done anything, beyond what I've mentioned to improve the fiscal outlook, and I think that's a shame.
Nobody covers business like Bloomberg.
All right, I'm Paul Sweeney alongside David Gurr. We're in New York City in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers radio studio. We're simulcasting on radio and TV. That's what makes it a special Bloomberg Markets here.
What's that?
Yeah, it's great.
Multi-platform.
We got everything going on here.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they're going to cut it up for some kind of podcasting intraweb type of thing.
And maybe some awards. as well, if we're lucky.
Exactly right. Looking at the markets here in this first 15 minutes of trading, S&P trading off about 15 points, the NASDAQ off about 50 points, so about 1/4%, not much happening as you would expect, lighter than normal volume. Yields grinding higher, that's how I'm going to continue to characterize them. 10-year Treasury up 4 basis points, 4.63%. I'm not refinancing my mortgage anytime soon. The rates market is not cooperating. WTI crude oil pretty steady here, just around $70 a barrel. Tom Keene, the Bitcoin quote of the morning, down 2.9% at around 95,500 for Bitcoin. So there you go, David.
Holiday shout out to one Tom Keene. Well, markets appear to be ending the year on a high note, but there is a perspective on Wall Street that U.S. equities are due for a downturn. Interactive Brokers Group Chairman Thomas Petterfy holds that concern. He recently spoke with Bloomberg's Sonali Basak about that and his thoughts on cryptocurrency.
I'm afraid that the markets are becoming overextended, and that sometime in the future we will have a downturn in the markets. But I don't think it's going to be a very violent and very far. It will not go very far. So I'm extremely optimistic about the next 4 years and maybe even thereafter.
The other thing where a lot of investors are expecting much lighter regulation is in the world of cryptocurrencies. How do you feel about cryptocurrencies from where you stand? And do you think that when your clients are going to Interactive Brokers, it's going to be something they're asking about more and more and more?
So cryptocurrencies are a very interesting area. We have been into cryptocurrencies for about 3 years. We charge less commission on a cryptocurrency trade than any other firm other than Robinhood, but Robinhood has a wider spread because they get their commissions paid by the market maker who they send their orders to. So I think on balance, our platform is probably the most efficient one for a crypto trader. Otherwise, to tell you frankly, I am sort of scared of cryptos because, they can go to any price because it's basically just a figment of imagination. So it doesn't have any underlying value. The only value it has is the same as the paper dollar, which is nothing.
But you've seen people pour in nonetheless through ETFs. You saw the price of Bitcoin get to $100,000. Will the investor of tomorrow be more likely to buy Bitcoin or a U.S. stock?
Well, it depends. Well, for a Bitcoin, you can buy U.S. stocks, right? For a U.S. stock, it's more difficult to buy Bitcoin, right? So I think that anybody who does not have Bitcoin should have some Bitcoin, but not too much. I would recommend that people put maybe their 2 to 3% of their net worth into Bitcoin. And we, for example, will not allow anyone to invest more than 10% of their assets into Bitcoin because I think that would be very dangerous.
All right, that was Interactive Brokers Group Chairman Thomas Petterfy speaking with Sonali Basak, talking about the markets and the outlooks here. Well, it has been a big year for ETFs. We've been saying that for a number of years, and many other ETFs, just in general for that matter. The industry saw $1 trillion in inflows in 2024. That's a record, folks. There were 670 fund launches this year. For more on what to expect for 2025 for ETFs, we're joined by James Seifert. He is an ETF analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. James, you and Balchunas, I mean, you guys were born on third base. You thought you hit triples here. You are just on top of this ETF business like nobody else we know. We appreciate getting a few minutes of your time. What are you guys thinking about for 2025 for the ETF business?
Well, thanks for the kind compliments, and thanks for having me. It's kind of a backhanded compliment in a way, but yeah, I mean, this industry is on fire. I mean, this is where the money is going in traditional finance. If you look at however you slice it, I mean, I guess you could look to private credit and some private vehicles. There's a lot of money going in there. It's a little more opaque, obviously, the private name. But as far as ETFs go, as you mentioned it, we had over $1 trillion in inflows this year. That's just in the U.S. We're seeing massive inflows around the world. It's not just a U.S. story. It's a global story. So there's a lot of different things we're launching. We're seeing things getting more conservative, people launching products that people want to protect their downside. And we're seeing a huge growth in products of people that want to, lever themselves up and go 2x in single stocks. So we think all of that is going to continue. And we think we're also going to see an increasing trend of money going from the mutual fund wrapper into the ETF wrapper for a whole host of reasons.
James, there's been a lot of, shall we call it, thematic creativity in the ETF space over this last year. I've talked to Eric a bit about that. Are we seeing any winnowing, Paul, going through the stats of how many of these funds were launched over the course of the last year? What's the general sort of longevity of the funds that have been created so far, and sort of what accounts for the degree to which they're getting winnowed down, if at all?
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of the same thing that happens in many areas of the ETF industry. It's pretty common in traditional finance, really more broadly. Things get really hot, people get a lot of interest, a lot of money pours in, and they overbuild or over-launch products. And then over time, the products that didn't gain enough asset, aren't profitable, you name it, they'll start winnowing those things down. We're seeing a little bit of that now. Flows have slowed to the thematic sector, but still, we're pretty bullish on themes as far as a category of the ETF wrapper. Kind of what it does is, it's like, we call it conversational alpha for these advisors. They can talk about they're selling robotics, they're getting you involved in infrastructure. And a lot of these types of themes, it's more so, you're not investing in these products and you're investing in a sector ETF. These theme ETFs are going across a whole bunch of different sectors. So if you're looking at infrastructure, it's energy, it's industrials, materials, you name it. And you're basically getting these stocks across a whole bunch of different ways. So it's kind of repackaging sector investing into, a more conversational way of talking about investing. Obviously, there's been some ETFs that have been hit extremely hard. They tend to be volatile and risky. They're not always extremely diversified, but people like to invest in these things. What we see them being used as is, instead of thinking of them as like people are selling their S&P 500 ETF, it's more like they're investing in, a robotics ETF or a cryptocurrency equity ETF instead of going, a single stock. So it's more a single stock substitution than necessarily a broad allocation substitution that we're seeing these things used for.
Hey, James, I grew up on Wall Street as a sell-side analyst, and my customers, my clients were institutional, mutual funds. What is the future of the mutual fund today? I mean, I just don't know where they go long term, because it seems like all the fund flows are going to ETFs.
Yeah, I mean, no matter how you slice it, money is coming out of mutual funds. A lot of it, I would say most of it, is finding its way back into the ETF wrapper. Some of it's finding more private vehicles, SMAs, CITs, these other things that aren't a little more opaque, those private funds I was talking about before, but a lot of it is coming into ETFs. And if you just look at a trend of flows out of over the last 10 years, the money's going out of mutual funds and ETF. A lot of it has to do with is money leaving high-cost products and going to low-cost products. One of the things we're seeing, and we think is going to happen, there's over 30, I think there's 36 issuers that have now filed basically to bolt on an ETF share class to their mutual funds. So people are probably familiar with mutual fund share classes. Basically what a lot of these issuers want to do is bolt on an ETF share class onto the end. Vanguard's structure has been like this. They've kind of been grandfathered into this process. A lot of other issuers are going to follow suit as soon as the SEC allows this to happen. We think 2025 could be the year that these things finally get the green light from the SEC. The one thing I would say is that if these are approved, it often takes like a year, 2 years, maybe a little bit more before we see a huge trend of people jumping on the bandwagon and figuring out exactly how they want to do this. But there's a pileup of issuers and asset managers that want to do this. And we'll also see the opposite. We'll see some really successful ETFs. There might be reasons like 401k wrappers and things where they might even bolt on mutual fund share classes to the ETF. So there's going to be this whole trend. I think the trend is clear. It's going to be mutual funds to ETFs, high cost to low cost. It's a little bit right now, it has been active to passive, but that's starting to change now in the ETF world. Active is doing extremely well.
James Seifert is an ETF analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. James, great to speak with you about all that's happening in this space. And James, bringing up just a moment ago the prospect for more approval by regulators. Of course, there's a lot of optimism that under Paul Atkinson's presumed leadership of the SEC, maybe some more of these crypto-based ETFs are going to get through. I think there are a lot of crypto investors, institutional investors, who are watching that space, looking to see what happens in that way. And as he was talking about, just the amount of growth that we've seen in ETFs overall has just been astonishing. And your question, Paul, a very good one, just about what happens to mutual funds as we see this kind of pivot away from them into ETFs. And just certainly a lot happened here in 2024 in that world, a lot likely to happen here going forward. Coming up here on Bloomberg, Carol Pepper is going to join us at Pepper International. She's the CEO as we look at her outlook for 2025. This is Bloomberg.
In case you missed it, on Bloomberg Technology.
I believe that we would love OpenAI models inside of AWS. Absolutely. It's we listen to our customers, and if that's something that customers want, we're absolutely game. Obviously, with a partnership, it takes multiple sources, and there's probably some complexities in there, as you allude to. But I think in the fullness of time, it likely is the case.
Don't miss Bloomberg Technology live every weekday.
We felt strongly that there has been an opportunity for there to be an experience on mobile that is centered around gamers. Like, we talk a lot about how there's 3 billion gamers in the world. 2 of those billion play on mobile, and half of those actually play on mobile and they play on another device. But there isn't actually a gaming platform and store experience that is centered around players and goes truly across device, where who you are, your library, your identity, your rewards, that travels with you versus being locked to a single ecosystem. And we've recognized that opportunity for a long time, but we wanted to make sure that anything we built was really grounded in people who play those mobile native games and the creators of them. And so being joined with a team that has real deep expertise in mobile was important to us.
A continent of vast opportunity and endless potential, but not without its challenges. Bloomberg highlights the players and unpacks the issues shaping the African story. We'll bring you interviews with key newsmakers and expert analysis, getting to the heart of business, politics, and economics in the region. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja, and this is Africa Amplified.
Our investigation found some of the worst cases of harm were surfacing.
मुझे क्या पता कि भाला के चक्कर में मेरा ही बुरा हो जाएगा।
I never thought I would be vulnerable to a scam. This ruined me, and I didn't have any real good explanation for it.
Wildlife trafficking is almost always driven by greed.
Once you start focusing on money, you lose sight of what is best. That's where things go wrong.
From the beating heart of global finance, economics, and politics, and wherever newsmakers are moving markets, Bloomberg brings you conversations that allow for deep discussions and important insights. What do you think the future is for inflation? Is this a new normal? Are markets too optimistic? How do you worry about the things that are outside your control? How does the current fighting completely stop? I'm Francine Lacqua, and this is The Pulse, every weekday only on Bloomberg.
Good Thursday morning, good Boxing Day morning. I'm all in on this Boxing Day thing. I'm Paul Sweeney alongside David Gura. This is a special edition of Bloomberg Markets. Why is it special, you ask? Bloomberg TV and radio simulcast.
The conjunction is the special
the conjunction is exactly rolling on the conjunction here. Looking at the markets here, just a little bit of a sell-off, folks. Look at the S&P off about 15 points, the Dow off 90 points, the NASDAQ off 66 points. All that kind of like 0.2–0.3% sell-off. We're about 25–30% below normal volume here, as you would expect on a holiday week here. Yields pushing higher here. 10-year Treasury 4.62%. WTI crude oil pretty steady, heading just sitting right around $70 a barrel. And Bitcoin down 3% here, 95,400 on the crypto currency. So there's not a whole lot going on out there, but we're going to stay on top of it for you.
Our volume is steady.
Our output is We're here every day. We're here. We just crank it out. We're here every day. The markets are open, which means we're open. It's very simple for us. Let's take a look at some of the stocks moving under the surface. Bloomberg's Alex Semenova joins us here in our interactive broker studio. Alex, what are you looking at?
Guys, so of course a bit of a down day in the market today, but Apple's still up about 0.3%. This is after it got a price target upgrade from, unsurprisingly, Wedbush. Dan Ives raised it to a street high of $325 from $300. He said that the company is heading into a multi-year AI-driven iPhone upgrade cycle. Basically, he's saying that with all the app upgrades from artificial intelligence, consumers are going to upgrade their iPhones. I don't know about you guys. I'm probably due for a new iPhone as well. He has an outperform rating on the stock, of course. Big Apple bull, Dan Ives. The stock, very small move today, but up 34% year to date. Incredible rally in that company.
Dan is a pro. First of all, he's a perma bull on everything. But on Apple, he knows what he's doing here. Nobody's in the office today. There is no news. So when you just raise your price target, it gets a Bloomberg head. It gets Alex Semenova talking about it. It gets him in the news. He knows what he's doing here in terms of that, so I admire him for that.
Nobody's escaping the real talk from Paul Sweeney today.
No, exactly. And by the way, he is a permeable not only on tech stocks, but also on Penn State football. I bet you that he will be at the Fiesta Bowl rooting on his Penn State Nittany Lions.
We will check in with him shortly after this. Alex, I know you're looking at retail, not here in the U.S., but in Asia. Alibaba, very much in the news this morning.
Yeah, another company on the move. This is after it agreed to merge its South Korean operations with eMart's e-commerce platform. The move is intended to help the company better compete in the country's fast-paced online retail sector. This is a 50-50 joint venture. This is according to a stock exchange filing by eMart, which confirmed a Bloomberg News report. Our reporters here, of course, getting the scoop on this deal. People familiar with the matter say that it is estimated to be valued at about $4 billion. Little move here on Alibaba, about 1%, but it is up around 11% this year, valuing the firm at about $200 billion.
My good friend Joe Tsai from high school, co-founder of Alibaba, he nicely retired. He was all happy, owning the nets, having some fun. Jack Ma says, no, you need to come back and work and kind of run this company. And
advantageous for him.
Exactly. So my boy Joe's back at work.
How about just in terms of any sectors you're watching, kind of winners and losers over the course of the trading day thus far?
Yeah, it's of course been an incredible year, actually. Just taking a look at the S&P 500 leaderboard, all 10 of 11 S&P 500 sectors in the green. Some of the winners include communication services, information technology, consumer discretionary stocks. These are, of course, some of the sectors that house these so-called Magnificent Seven companies. NVIDIA, Tesla, all in those names. Financials is also a winning sector, with investors expecting deregulation, increased merger activity, utilities also benefiting from the AI frenzy, one of the sectors that really got a boost from expectation for more data center usage. And then some of the losers, even the losers are in the green. You have real estate, healthcare, energy, underperforming the S&P 500, but still up year to date. Real estate, of course, weighed down by higher interest rates. Healthcare, because investors are opting for growth-focused sectors like AI instead of some of the cyclical sectors like healthcare. Energy as well, due to volatility in oil prices. Falling oil prices expected to kind of hurt some of the oil companies' earnings results. And then materials is actually the only sector that is slightly in the red, but even flat year to date.
Alex, thank you very much. Alex Semenova joining us here in the studio. We'll have more updates on the markets over the course of the morning. I'm going to pick up on what we were just talking about there as we bring in Carol Pepper, the CEO of Pepper International. We're going to talk a bit about her outlook for the year ahead. Alex bringing up the Magnificent Seven. There are plenty of Grinches who are saying it's overdone, it's been too narrow, maybe we should be a little more pessimistic as we get ahead into 2025. Carol, what are you thinking? How much optimism are you allowing to seep into your outlook for the year ahead?
Oh, I'm very optimistic. I think this is going to be a fantastic year in the markets. First of all, we're still in an election relief rally as far as I'm concerned because people are very happy. The U.S. transitioned successfully, and we're looking toward a very good 2025. There's so many family offices, for example. I manage money for family offices with over 100 million, and believe me, all the 500 millionaires want to be billionaires this year. And the way to do that is to get invested into the market. This is no time to wring your hands on the sidelines and think what might happen. Look at people who did that last year, missed a tremendous year in the market. So I'm very optimistic. I do think the leaders will continue to lead. I think we're only at the edge of what AI is going to be able to do. So good year coming. Put the fear away and let's go make some money.
That's to be a 500 millionaire.
Yes.
I'd take it. Sure.
Exactly,
I wouldn't wring my hands,
Hey, Carol, I want to follow up on that just, Carol. Can you tell us, what's a typical client of yours, and what's a typical family office these days? Is it somebody who owned a business and they sold their business and now they really have to think about, boy, what do I do with all the proceeds? What's a typical family office account for you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of folks out there who have made an exit and they're ready to now start going on to the next stage of diversifying and moving away from their operating company. There are a lot of real estate billionaires and millionaires, multimillionaires out there who are transitioning the business to the next generation. So they're ready to build a more robust structure for, again, diversifying outside of their core real estate holdings. And there's just a lot of people who are, kids are getting ready to take over the business. Quote unquote, kids are 30 and 40. And now it's time for them to take over all the family holdings, and they want a family office because it's a much better way to actually organize all your affairs effectively. And from a tax advantage point of view, from an estate planning point of view, you want to be one of those families that makes it past the second, third, and fourth generation. You need a family office. And I've been in this business for 24 years, and I've seen the tremendous growth in family offices because it is the right solution. Each one can be tailored for each family's requirements.
Carol, you mentioned tax policy, and it's a good jumping off point for me to ask about the year ahead when it comes to policy, and President-elect, of course, talking a good game about Congress's ability to renew the tax cuts he put in place when he was in office last time. What are you telling clients just about how they should be gaming that out, what the tax picture is going to look like in the year ahead? How much of a sure thing or a done deal do you think that renewal is going to be?
I think it's a fairly good done deal, actually. I do think that those deductions are very popular. I think they will consider. I think that's one of the reasons a lot of people voted for Trump. They really were looking for a lower tax policy, and that was a big driver in certainly many family offices' decision makings. What can we do about tax policy? Because family offices really believe a lot in, returning money to the people that made it and letting them see how they can invest it on behalf of society and themselves. So yeah, I think that we're probably going to get the tax breaks that we want this year. At least the first year. Once we come to the midterms, of course, all bets are off. We'll see.
Exactly. All right. So for 2025, is there a theme you're stressing with your clients this year, Carol?
Sure. The big become better.
Wow. I like that.
Stick with NVIDIA, stick with Amazon, stick with Apple, stick with the winners. The winners are going to win more. It's a winners take all type of a market, and you can't fight that. You don't have to be cute. You just have to follow the massive trends, and then you'll win. I mean, it's really not a hard market in that respect. But what will be hard is when there are those pauses and consolidations, you have to stick to your convictions and stay invested. This is not a market to trade in and out of. Just ride it up to the end of the next year. And when we're having this conversation, we'll be very happy we did that.
Is there anything novel about the market that we're in right now as you see it? I've heard some folks talk about the fact that traditionally when you have a bull market, it starts kind of broad and narrows. And here, I guess, if you look at the bull market we've been in, we've seen it start extremely narrow, talking about the Magnificent Seven once again, broaden out a little bit. It does strike me that's kind of unique when you look at history as kind of a guide for what this market's doing.
Yeah, well, because that implies that, there were fewer and fewer winners as time went on in those polls, and that's how they petered out. But in this case, actually, a few companies started the AI craze, and that is now going to spread to larger sectors. We're seeing this now, for example, with the spread of AI fever into the utilities sector. Who would have thought of sleepy old utilities as an exciting sector? But you're going to have great dividends, and you're suddenly getting a lot of new technology applied to that sector. So this new technology we don't even know yet what it's going to be. It's just in its infancy, and it's going to spread. So we'll go from more narrow to wider this time. I think that's a great observation. And that calls, in my mind, that means we're going to have a very strong year this year. There'll also be a lot of enthusiasm to give President Trump a chance. So let's see what he can do. But it's not just him. It's going to be the Congress. It's going to be the Senate. And then, again, you have to look at the rest of the world. There's still a massive inflow of non-U.S. money. I work with a lot of non-U.S. family offices, and they love this market. In comparison, our market is phenomenal, and there's a massive weight of money that will continue to flow our way.
All right, that's
the point you've been making all morning. Yeah, that point about international money is what you've been hitting on.
It's just been amazing. We hear that more and more. Carol, what could trip us up here? I mean, I know you have a bullish call
trying
there.
To get some pessimism out of it.
Yeah, let's throw some pessimism out there. What could really, I mean, other than a black swan that none of us can predict, is there any risk out there that maybe either you think about or your clients think about?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're in New York, you can't help but thinking about the real estate risk. You know, everybody's been rolling the real estate risk over and over again, and you know the rates are just not low enough right now to really get people moving on real estate. Real estate is a massive sector in our economy, so I hope we get more than 2. It'd be nice if we got 3 cuts. I think that would help. So keep your eye on real estate and be careful about real estate. But I do think when it turns, there's a lot of pent-up demand. It's just a question of will it break before it turns? That's the real question. It's hard to tell right now.
We got these jobless claims data this morning, kind of meh, although as our colleagues pointed out, the highest we've seen in what, a couple years, I think. Yeah. When you look at the health of the overall economy, again, picking up on the fact that you're very optimistic about the path forward here, are there any, if not flashing red lights, things that do give you pause, or things that you're returning to, more data points you're mostly interested in checking in on?
Yeah, well, I think you do have to watch the labor market, obviously. But again, it's fairly flat. It was overall claims were down 1,000. It was, of course, ongoing claims that were up a bit.
Yep.
And would that data point have gotten so much attention if we weren't in Christmas week? I'm not so sure. So it's pretty much been a steady picture. But yes, you have to keep your eye on the overall economy. But you have to keep your eye right now on consumer confidence and how are people doing. They were out shopping. They're still going to keep going forward. They're going to keep borrowing. It's the American way. So I'm not that worried about our economy. I think we really did achieve a soft landing, and this gives us a tremendous runway to start moving toward growth now that we, have inflation relatively tamed. I mean, yes, is it not too? If it were only 2% or 1%, probably the economy would be in a lot worse trouble than it is. So inflation doesn't worry me. I think we're in a steady path, and with a little bit of tax help, we could actually have a really fantastic year. So I'm not terribly worried about this economy, and I do see that weight of foreign money continuing to prop up the market because on a relative basis, we're still the best game in town. And all those family offices want to make more money this year. So a lot more money that's on the sidelines is going to come off this year. They were waiting last year, nervous about the elections. I think more nervous maybe than they needed to be, but they were just worried. And so now that we've gotten past that, I think, the green lights are going to be on, and people that have been waiting around and missed 30-year upswing in the NASDAQ, for example, last year, they missed 30%. That's a lot to miss. Will probably dip their toes and at least get started this year.
Some optimism there from Carol Pepper of Pepper Internet. Plenty of optimism, and I'm grateful for it here on the eve of New Year's Eve. Some of the busiest travel days ever just happened this past week. Talked about retail. Let's talk a little bit about that. We're going to discuss that coming up here on Bloomberg.
It's the world's second largest economy with a growing influence in global affairs. But geopolitical uncertainties, deflationary pressures, and questions about foreign investment linger. Bloomberg, the China Show, brings you the unmatched expertise you need to keep track of breaking news, in-depth market analysis, and the most influential newsmakers in and around China. Bloomberg, the China Show, weeknights at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
AI, how it has penetrated pretty much all sectors, including music. AI can write music, compose music. How do you see AI changing the landscape in fashion?
Yeah, AI definitely helped. When I did the jewelry, I used the AI, helping me to give some idea, but ultimately you still have to do a lot of it. To just give you very superficial ideas, and but at the end you still have to customize and how to really make it and do that. I do not think that AI and the technology can replace the human mind at this moment.
Are you concerned one day we won't be able to differentiate designs by AI and designs by an actual designer?
I don't know. For me, I see that, when a designer doing is the spirit, is the heart that the computer don't have.